What's up? I am David Long. For those of you who don't know, I am an integral philosopher and a critic of both Jordan Peterson and Ken Wilber. I've made videos about both of these guys, and when this new video by Rebel Wisdom came out, where Ken Wilber was talking about Jordan Peterson and saying that he was integral, I got several emails asking me to say what I think about this. We're gonna start right up front, where I'm gonna tell you why Jordan Peterson is not integral, and then we're gonna go further. We're gonna talk about feminism just a little bit. We're gonna talk about development a little bit. Then we're gonna talk about Ken Wilber, mythology, Sam Harris, and we're gonna wrap the whole thing up and be done with it. I'm trying to move this thing along. It is heavily edited and condensed down. It was originally much longer. But without further ado, okay, let's get it started.
What do these two hugely influential thinkers have in common? Where do they disagree? And what can they learn from each other?
A lot of times when it comes to Jordan Peterson, it's not that I'll disagree with much of what he says. I agree with much of what he says. It's some of the things that he leaves out.
I actually agree with a lot of what both of these guys say. I'm critical of both of them, but the reason I'm so critical of both of them is because I agree with so much of what they say. And I think the more agreement you have with a person, the more important those areas of disagreement seem. When you have so many core agreements with a person, so many things where it seems like we should just agree because we have the same methodology, we have the same standards. It's like in science. If you perform the same tests in the same kinds of ways and you come up with different conclusions with the same standards, you start to be like, okay, what's going on here? So the more agreement you have, the more the disagreements stand out, the more important they become. And figuring out who gets it right and why is important because it allows us to understand how to get it right and how to get it wrong. Then we can start to add that to our epistemic filter and make better and better discriminations and thus have better and better actions in the world. Let's continue.
Jordan Peterson has become a global celebrity by weaving together mythology, science, philosophy, and religion into a compelling theory of everything.
All right, hold on. Here we are, 16 seconds in. Jordan Peterson has a compelling theory of everything. In this video, we're going to be talking about how Ken Wilber, Sam Harris, and Jordan Peterson rise up to or fail to live up to integral standards. What does that mean? Integral is about integrating diversity with discernment, and that discernment part is key. The core lenses of an integral perspective are summarized in AQAL, or all quadrants, all levels, but it equally connotes all lines, all states, and all types. All quadrants, all levels, all lines, all states, and all types. So during the course of this video, we're going to be looking at how each one of these people relates to quadrants. Do they include all the quadrants? To lines. Do they have a healthy relationship with lines? Do they include lines? To stages. Do they include the stages? And of course, we're going to be paying attention to the positive and negative ideas associated with or correlated with different stages of development. And to states, or waking up, as well as growing up. We don't really get into types too much in this video. Suffice to say, everyone mentioned in this video accepts types, and that's probably why we're not talking about it. For example, in this video, it said that Jordan Peterson is a lower left quadrant reductionist, and it's implied that Ken Wilber gives too much emphasis to the upper left quadrant. It's also implied that Sam Harris only includes the exterior quadrants and ignores the interior quadrants. The idea is that we want to include all of these things and not reduce it to just the parts that we know about or like. So when I talk later about making the right distinctions, these are the kind of distinctions I'm going to be looking for or listening for. Just because you integrate in different ideas from different perspectives, from mythology, from science, from religion, from philosophy, doesn't mean you have a clear, concise, well-articulated, or well-understood worldview. Integrating in a bunch of different perspectives is what starts to happen at green or postmodern stages. This is why they accept and love everyone. But at integral stages, we integrate diversity with discernment. And Jordan Peterson's discernment is not really consistent. He can use a Jungian approach to archetypes and mythology a lot of the time, but then other times his discernment isn't so good, where he can't answer a simple question about whether Jesus, a literal historical person, was resurrected from the dead or not, or whether that's a metaphor.
Do you believe that Jesus rose again from the dead? Literally.
I cannot answer that question. And the reason is because, okay, let me think about it for a minute, see if I can come up with a reasonable answer to that. Well, the first answer would be, it depends on what you mean by Jesus.
A historical human being that existed, literally came back to life after death.
I would say that at the moment I'm agnostic about that issue.
That's
And
very
I
interesting.
can't explain why. When I get to the New Testament in my biblical lectures, I'll spend like 6 hours trying to explain what I think about that. But one of the things I have come to learn over the last 15 years in particular is that the world is a very, very strange place. It's far stranger than we think.
Someone once asked you whether you thought Jesus was literally resurrected, and you said, it would take me 40 hours to answer that question.
I said it would take me 40 hours to answer the question. I didn't say that he was.
How's this for an answer? Almost certainly not. What's wrong with that answer?
Well, in the case of Christ, let's assume he was a historical figure. Is his resurrection real? Did his body resurrect? I don't know. I don't know what happens to a person if they bring themselves completely into alignment. I've had intimations of what that might mean. We don't understand how the world could be mastered if it was mastered completely. We don't know how an individual might be able to manage that. We don't know what transformations that might make possible.
You'll notice when Peterson tells us the meaning of Genesis, he doesn't agree with the literal meaning.
It depends.
What I want to do is make an empirical case for the biblical stories and leave the metaphysical case hanging.
Peterson cannot consistently make transrational distinctions. He says he's agnostic about a lot of this stuff because things are weirder than we can know. He appeals to mystery. So again, he's not making these distinctions in a clear way. He still thinks that there's some magic stuff. He's not making these distinctions clearly. Wilber's giving him more credit than he's actually due. He also claims that shamanic people all over the world intuited DNA because there are intertwined snakes shown in art.
I really do believe this, although it's very complicated to explain why. I really believe that's a representation of DNA. And that representation, that entwined double helix, that is everywhere.
Instead of just realizing that these people have probably seen snakes mating.
Okay, here we go. Snake sex. They twisting like Chubby Checker. They twisting the night away. Do anybody sell snake pornos? This is amazing, cuz. Look at this. This is beautiful. It's like synchronized swimming. And snake sex is fun to watch. I could have two snakes that could do this and put them in a cage and just watch them do this all day.
So he's not real good with the integration of myth.
He won't himself profess belief in any of what those stages actually say.
I really do believe this, although it's very complicated to explain why. I really believe that's a representation of DNA.
Definitely there's tons of philosophy that he's not really doing well, like he's conflating the good and the true. So that's not off to a great start. His integration of science isn't great because he's not really skillfully integrating truth.
It sounds like what you're saying is that truth is as much about action as it is about some sort of material, measurable, objective reality.
No, I'm saying it's more about action.
More
Oh yes, the fundamentals of truth are those that guide action. And then the objective science is nested inside that. It has to be. Right. There's no way around that. There's only one way you can define truth in relationship to finite beings. It's true enough. True enough for what? True enough so that you survive and reproduce. That's it. You don't get to go any farther. What's more true than that? Sorry, can't ask that question. That's it. You've hit the limit. Ebola is not that contagious, and so that's kind of annoying if you're trying to kill people, whereas smallpox is really contagious. So if you could get the two together and then develop an aerosol spray, you could kill a lot of people. It isn't obvious to me that that's an invalid scientific pursuit. But I do think that it's an invalid ethical pursuit, and so that seems to me to indicate that the ethical pursuit supersedes the scientific pursuit with regards to truth claim. The fundamentals of truth are those that guide action, and then the objective science is nested inside that. The ethical pursuit supersedes the scientific pursuit with regards to truth claim.
It doesn't supersede with respect to the truth claim, it supersedes with respect to considerations of behavior and policy.
He's doing this type of lower left quadrant absolutism to the point of absurdity. Peterson is also making a truth claim about truth claims. So he's using the same notion of truth as accuracy, while also trying to say that truth only means goodness. So Sam points this out to him at a couple points, that he's conflating these different ideas and that becomes incredibly problematic. He is making truth claims, and it is either true or not, in an absolute sense.
There are facts of the matter, whether or not anyone understands them. And some of these facts have nothing to do with the survival of the species. One wonders whether this claim applies to itself. Is this claim about truth only true if it helps us survive? And what if it doesn't? Does it then bite its own tail and just disappear? Do you see the problem there? You clearly have to have a conception of facts and truth that is possible to know, that exceeds what anyone currently knows and exceeds any concern about whether it is useful or compatible with your own survival even to know these truths. Now, the claim about whether or not she's cheating on you is an intelligible claim. That's a claim that has absolutely nothing to do with whether or not you wind up killing yourself based on your reaction to this unhappy truth. If you then wound up killing yourself, we could say at the end of the day, well, it would be better if he hadn't known that. It would certainly be better if she hadn't done that. It would have been better if he had married a different woman.
It might be better if he would have paid attention to his damn marriage and to attribute
Jordan, you have to grant one thing here. There's one piece that doesn't get moved here. You cannot move the piece that because you killed yourself, it's not true that she was having an affair. That move is not open to you, and yet you're acting like it is.
What I found really fascinating about Jordan Peterson, watching especially the Maps of Meaning series, is that he is also attempting a real integral theory of everything. This reminded me very much of your project. How do you feel that his thought maps onto yours, and what are the core differences?
Point about Jordan Peterson is that he has an enormous amount of respect for objective science.
Come on. He does not have an enormous amount of respect for objective science. He conflates the good and the true. If you've listened to his podcasts with Sam Harris about truth, it's like forehead slappingly painful. Even most of his fans were like, are you freaking kidding me? He is a lower left quadrant reductionist. He does not respect science. Like, now people are going to be like, what do you mean? He quotes science here, or he quotes science there. Dude, postmodernists will cherry pick science. Even traditional people will appeal to science if they think it agrees with them. They tend to ignore science in the way that it disagrees with them.
Okay, well then I would say that I don't think that facts are necessarily true. So I don't think that scientific facts, even if they're correct from within the domain that they were generated, I don't think that that necessarily makes them true.
He has an enormous amount of respect for objective science.
Just think about that question where he can't answer whether Jesus rose again from the dead. He just says, oh, things are weirder than we think, appealing to mystery. I don't know, I'm agnostic about it. That Sam Harris talk on truth is just painful. Anybody who thinks that Jordan Peterson appreciates objective truth, just go listen to that. And that should stop that from happening. And his integration of religion isn't great because he favors Christianity over all other traditions.
Again, this has been focused through the lens of your attachment to Christianity largely, but Hinduism is a completely different set of stories. Many of them have the opposite valence from any Christian story you would tell. Good and evil do not have the same meaning in the East. Evil is just ignorance on some level.
You haven't met any real evil people if you believe that.
Well, okay, so then all the Hindus and Buddhists are wrong about this. That's a possible claim. I'm just saying that there's over 1 billion people who have a religious system of stories from which they derive all kinds of meaning, to which they're mightily attached, where we could play the same game of archetypal interpretation and valuing, and yet the cash value with respect to good and evil is irreconcilable with what you get from Christianity. Look, presumably, Hinduism is also useful as a set of heuristics for Hindus. If Hinduism and Christianity are irreconcilable, then there must be a deeper level of reality that explains why they both work, that can't be reducible to Christianity being true or Hinduism being true.
So this is not a skillful, integral perspective that we're talking about. He doesn't even have a transpersonal view. This is why he gets confused about whether Jesus was literally resurrected from the dead or not, is because he still kind of thinks that the story of Jesus is about a historical person and he's not really taking it metaphorically. We've seen him make a distinction between Jesus and the Christ, but I haven't heard him invite you to be the Christ or say that I myself am a manifestation of the Christ. Like, he doesn't own that God in first person. He doesn't have that kind of transpersonal view.
Peterson is perfectly aware of waking up. He's absolutely aware of it. But he doesn't really talk about that. So he talks about more the growing up components and how that happened.
Totally agree. He doesn't talk about the waking up stuff. He talks about growing up. He talks about ego development. He's all vertical, no horizontal, and only vertical up to a certain point. He basically wants people to develop their ego up to like rational and traditional and stop there. When it comes to having a transpersonal perspective, his advice to people is go clean your room, get your stuff together, develop a healthy ego, which are more the values at Orange, the achiever self, reinforce reinforced by this traditional idea. His rule 6 is, until you've put your house in perfect order, don't criticize the world. This is an adaptation of the idea of take the plank out of your own eye before you worry about the speck in your brother's. So these are traditional and modern conventional ideas. These are not transpersonal, existentially aware, ego construct aware perspectives on religion and the self. And Peterson has no clear, articulated book about a theory of everything. He talks about being clear in your speech as another one of his rules, Rule 10. But when it comes to words, Jordan Peterson has been compared to Deepak Chopra in terms of the weaselly way he changes definitions or over-convolutes ideas.
I'm convinced that he's one of the most overrated public intellectuals of our time, and that this is especially the case when it comes to his views on religion. In fact, I will go so far as to say that Jordan Peterson is the Deepak Chopra of Christianity. Peterson is no doubt a very smart, knowledgeable and insightful person, but when it comes to religion, he's no better than any other apologist. He manipulates language, misrepresents philosophy and science, and is fallacious in his reasoning.
That's part of Jordan Peterson's shtick, to kind of leave things undefined or muddy the waters or get bogged down in the semantics of the meanings of words in order to kind of do a bit of a sleight of hand thing and make you think that the stuff that he's saying is deeper or more profound than it actually is.
Slavery is condoned in the Bible, in both Testaments, and in the Quran. There's no getting away from that. Now, you can say, well, it's not the central thrust of any of these books, but if you go to the books and try to figure out what the creator of the universe wants with respect to the owning and needless immiseration of other people, he expects you to keep slaves, and he's told you how to do it. The problem was they were actually on the losing side of a theological argument, and it would be much better, I think you would agree, if one of the 10 commandments had been, don't keep slaves. There's certainly one we could swap out for that one.
Would you agree that there are things written into these religious texts that are unambiguously unacceptable viewed through a modern lens, and not because the texts are so complicated that we have misunderstood something, but there are things that are just written in there that we now understand to be wrong?
You have to read the beginning as if it's also influenced by the end, which is what, by the way, and in case you think that I'm weaseling around here, and I'm not, is that that's exactly what you do every time you read any story, any work of fiction. Like if you're a screenwriter, for example, there's an old dictum that if there's a rifle lying on a table in the first scene, that it better be used by the end of the second scene or it shouldn't have been there at all. So there's this coherence.
I'm looking for the rifle in your answer to this question, though.
Yeah,
I want it to be used. Jesus never envisioned a world without slavery, and he admonished slaves to serve their masters well and to serve their Christian masters especially well.
The English Protestants wouldn't have agreed with that because, like I said, they were at the forefront of the fight against slavery.
Okay,
so
but
I think
they
there was
were
a
clearly
range
influenced by something outside the text. And this is, again, you're making this harder than it is, and my concern is why. Right?
Well, I don't think I am, Sam, because I think that the fundamental message in the New Testament, for example, is that...
So Jews are in possession of a book that has some diabolical passages that would be better left out.
Again, how is this not weaseling? Why doesn't Jordan simply say, yes, the verses that command us to keep slaves and execute homosexuals, apostates, and blasphemers are unacceptable?
If I got his back to the wall, Deepak could honestly say, listen, I've never said anything about crystals, right? I'm not selling crystals. I've never said they work. But it's the way in which he's failing to make the clear differentiation. If you're in a parish of one, but not in the parish that has anything in common with the Bible thumpers in my country who think that Jesus is very likely coming back in their lifetime because he never died, and he's going to judge the living and the dead, and there will be a resurrection, hellfire, and all the rest. If that's not the game you're playing at all, own it.
Like half the time when Harris is asking him this stuff, Peterson is trying to find a way that what Sam Harris said wasn't true. Sam Harris is like, well, you can't really pray and make things come true. And then Peterson finds an extreme version of how that could be possible. And it's like, sure, that kind of works, and you're sort of making the distinction, but why don't you just start from Sam Harris's side and then move outward?
I say, I don't believe in ghosts, and you say, no, you do believe in ghosts. Ghosts are your relationship to the unseen. That's a ghost. So you have a new definition of ghost that you're putting in the place provided, which I have to say, well, of course I have a relationship to the unseen, so yeah, I guess I do believe in ghosts. You know, you win that argument. But that simply isn't what most people mean by a ghost.
Be like, look, Sam, I totally agree with you that there's no literal God, that praying is just talking to yourself, that it's not literally true and it doesn't actually work in the kind of way that a lot of people think that it does. Of course, that's childish and ridiculous. But there's this metaphorical way in which God does care if you masturbate. All of these kinds of examples where it's just like Peterson ends up taking the other extreme just to be like, well, so what if God does care about masturbating? Or what if God does answer prayer? So instead of doing the integral thing and starting from the inside, agreeing with the person and helping them to expand their perspective further, he just takes the oppositional position in kind of a snarky sort of a way, like, well, see, Sam, you don't really know what you're talking about. Like, it's just unskillful and not really pointed. Even if he's kind of right, he's not really skillfully and consistently making those distinctions, especially for people who do disagree with him, and it does still end up feeling really weaselly. Like, you're still just justifying the thing instead of being willing to admit that it's not really literally true. And I mean, even Sam Harris and this other guy bring to him this distinction, like, can we make the distinction between literal truth and metaphorical truth? And Peterson's not even happy to like jump on this distinction and be like, yes, that's what I'm talking about. Peterson's not really doing a good job when it comes to this distinction. Again, not as good of a job as a lot of people are wanting to give him credit for. It's like they're not really looking at everything that he's saying. They're just seeing that he's kind of doing it a lot of the time, but not really seeing the big picture of all of what he's saying and all of what he's trying to do and how he doesn't consistently integrate in mythology or consistently deal with religion with fair overarching standards. Anyways, I digress. The point being, integrating in a bunch of different ideas does not make you integral. It's the way that we integrate, our epistemology, our method of integration, the distinctions that we make, our epistemology as a filter for ideas. It's those distinctions that make a person integral. I do have a video about integral epistemology, or what we call integral methodological pluralism, which is about including all the different methods, but including them in context in a way that takes into account the different strengths and weaknesses of each different approach to truth. And as you will clearly hear if you listen to his talks with Sam Harris, Peterson does not have the best relationship with the truth, definitely not an integral perspective on truth. Let's continue.
Theory is the idea that cultures and societies go through specific levels of development in the same way as individuals do, becoming more sophisticated as they develop or grow up. It's an idea that's common to developmental theorists, including Peterson's favourite, Jean Piaget.
You move from one knowledge structure to the next one, which includes the previous one and is better. And it's better because it covers more territory. That's how you know it's better. It does the same thing the old tool does, plus some additional things. So it's a definition of better.
So here it's saying, hey, look, Jordan Peterson's talking about hierarchy, and spiral dynamics is talking about hierarchy. Integral? No. We know Peterson understands the concept of hierarchy, but it seems like his understanding of hierarchy more has to do with development of particular lines. You can get good at different competencies.
But then there are growth hierarchies.
Are those the same thing as what Peterson would describe as hierarchies of competence?
Close to it.
But I'm not sure if he actually sees stages of development like integralists do, because I don't think that he would say that postmodernists are at a higher stage than modernists and traditionalists. And he clearly doesn't see that there are higher stages still.
If you look at all of the sort of dozen or so multiple intelligences, and again, if you don't like that concept, I know Peterson doesn't like that.
That's true. Peterson does reduce all lines to cognitive development. He says there are not multiple intelligence, that everything reduces back to cognitive. And so talk about a reductionist perspective. Come on, you guys. Where are his integral ideas? You could point to the one like, he reads mythology poetically. Sort of, but he still takes Christianity literally and favors that one tradition. If that's the only thing that we're going to say is integral about this dude, or that he takes into account multiple traditions, some parts of it, some parts of science, some parts of philosophy, some parts of religion, some parts of other mythology, that does not make for an integral perspective.
You can integrate all the fantasies you want. But it doesn't bring you truth.
Anyways.
The developmental viewpoint never gets mentioned with Jordan.
Yeah, even though he seems like he should know Piaget, he should understand some of these basic stages of development, he should be describing some of that stuff, he doesn't. And again, if we're looking at Jung, and we know he knows about Campbell, there's plenty of other distinctions that his predecessors have made that he doesn't make. So Peterson is not even rising up to the level of the people who he's learned from. He's not standing on their shoulders and building higher. He's not even rising to their level.
And they're looking out there to see what is really missing. Because that's how an integral thinker thinks, is, wait, there's a little bit of truth in all of this.
It is great that Peterson, as a postmodern thinker, can appreciate the value of traditional and modern worldviews. But part of the reason is because he still holds on to some problematic traditional and modern worldviews. Dude hasn't outgrown the stuff. He's regressive. He's not progressive and integrative. He himself is a postmodernist who attacks postmodernism. He's like a self-hating postmodernist. What he's saying, because he's so intelligent, resonates with people who are at traditional and modern stages. They hear him talking about postmodernism and its problems and how they don't appreciate the traditional and modern worldviews, and they're like, yeah, Peterson's right. So most of Peterson's fans are conventional thinking people. Peterson's conventional, and by conventional, I mean people at traditional, modern, and now postmodern stages. Before, conventional was mostly traditional and modern, but more and more postmodern thinking is starting to be a part of the common zeitgeist, a part of the convention, and actually less and less the traditional. So these are the stages that Peterson is at. Peterson is a product of the current zeitgeist. He is totally conventional thinking, all fighting with itself inside of his mind. He has some really high-minded ideas that are really smart, like his ability to understand some basic hierarchy stuff and his ability to do the Jungian poetic read of symbolism sometimes, most of the time. But he still believes in traditional, literal Christian ideas and still has pre-trans confusions and is still very conservative. And he's trying to silence the voices of young people who want to change the world by telling them to shut up and go clean their room. How condescending is that? This dude doesn't have a transpersonal worldview. He's not like Sam Harris, who says that there's no such thing as the self, talking about introducing people to meditation and deconstructing the self. This idea from Joseph Campbell that you can recreate yourself in terms of who you want to be, follow your bliss. Jordan says that's dangerous, that we don't understand ourselves well enough to create ourselves. He also says it's dangerous to change around the fundamental parts of society because you'll end up in a ditch. So his idea of personal and cultural development beyond convention and tradition is you'll end up in a ditch. You don't know what you're doing. You'll end up in nihilism. You'll end up in totalitarianism. It's like nihilism or Nazis, meaninglessness. You're going to be in danger if you abandon the traditions and the maps of your culture. That's his main message. And it is coming from a postmodern kind of place of this retreat. Let's go back and hold on tight to what we have because the void is scary.
You're a cultural creature. You cannot live without your culture. You think you can, but you can't. Oh, you killed the thing that protects you. You just wait to see what happens, and that's exactly it. You killed the thing that structures you. You won't know it. It's like Nietzsche's prediction from the death of God. It's like, you killed this. You think, oh, it doesn't make any difference. It's like, wrong. You get rid of that thing that protects you, and chaos comes flooding in, and you have no idea what's possible. We do, though, because we lived through the 20th century. We know exactly what's possible. Hundreds of millions of unnecessary deaths. That's what's possible. We're lucky we didn't blow the whole damn thing up, and we still could. You step outside of the guidelines of your culture at your own peril. And modern people, because they're so coddled, think, oh yeah, well, we can handle it. It's like, sure, you can. You wait till you get there. You'll find out that you can't handle it, and it'll be too late. The whale that you were supposed to go confront and rescue your father from has risen out of the water and taken you down, and you're done. That's chaos.
Because the conclusions that postmodernism comes to will destroy society. So yes, he is looking back and re-including, but he's not re-including with integral distinctions. He's grabbing for these ideas like a crutch and a security blanket. Like he doesn't think that individuals or humanity in general is really ready to grow up and be mature and break our idols and be really responsible. Anyways, I'll keep going.
Those upper three are at each other's throats. They really don't like each other. They've increasingly come to hate each other in many ways. And the problem is because they're all first tier, they can't solve that problem ever. Because by definition, first tier thinks that its values are the only correct ones. But second tier, that has the inherent capacity to see the importance of all of these and at least start thinking about ways, okay, since everybody has to go through all of these, then an enlightened society would include ways to help us do that. And so that's one of the things that is a way out of the culture wars.
So here's actually a good point. Wilber says people at integral stages have gotten out of the culture wars, and they, if anything, go back in and then help to sort out the problems on these stages. This is not what Jordan Peterson is doing. Jordan Peterson advocates for traditional and conventional values. He's attacking green from a traditional and modern perspective. He's a major player in the culture wars. And his talks with Sam Harris, those are the highest peaks of his maturity, where him and Harris are like getting up to this point in their own development where they're hinting at this higher integral stage and what that might be in the future of their and humanity's development.
It's one thing to have your belief system shattered by the observation that there are other belief systems that are incommensurate but seem to have equal utility. But it's even worse is that once you make the observation that there are other belief systems that have equal utility, then it can shatter your belief in belief systems themselves. And then you're in the postmodern nihilist landscape, and that's a big problem.
Or you could just be in a more fundamental landscape that subsumes both of those belief systems.
That's fine. Let's hope that can happen. Yeah. But I would say that's the landscape that I'm trying to pursue.
They haven't totally gotten there yet and started working their way back down. If anybody's done something like that, it's actually Harris, who's not just this orange atheist that everybody likes to say, like he's this modern rational guy. He is a longtime meditator. He has a podcast called Waking Up, not just clean your room, kid, but like waking up. Then he also comes back and says, look, morality doesn't just have to be based on tradition and the absolute word of God. We can actually use things like science to figure out what's true. And if we know enough about what's true, if we come to some basic moral agreements, it follows that this and this is good for the things that we all value and that we should all value. Out of the two, between Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris is actually the one who's more coming back down the spiral and lifting people up to these higher stages of being able to actually make some real clear, skillful distinctions in the world, where he's talking about this moral landscape, which is something like a spectrum of betters. Not this simplistic, there's heaven and there's hell and there's order and there's chaos. This kind of simplistic, dualistic thinking is indicative of traditional thinking. Duality is not a spectrum. When you talk about a spectrum, it reveals a lot more nuanced thinking.
And so if you're somebody like Jordan Peterson, who is thinking integrally, and you're looking around and seeing what the hell's going on, and you're starting to notice this, and then the government comes along and says, oh, and by the way, I'm going to compel your speech, that would send anybody with integrity and integral thinking over the wall.
But that's not really what happened.
Peterson began to go in public and make all these outlandish claims about what these liberal and transgender activists were trying to do. He either purposely or through his own paranoia completely misrepresented the whole thing to make it seem like people were going to be forced to say things they didn't want to say. Compelled speech. But this was never the case. In fact, due to Peterson's misrepresentation of the bill, the Canadian Bar Association actually had to come out and write a letter debunking the things Peterson was claiming. This is from the Canadian Bar Association, and they said, recently the debate has turned to whether the amendments will force individuals to embrace concepts which they find objectionable. This is a misunderstanding of human rights and hate crimes legislation. For hate crimes, Bill C-16 adds gender identity and expression to the identifiable groups protected. From those who advocate genocide, publicly incite hatred likely to lead to a breach of the peace, or willfully promote hatred against them. For those compelled to speak and act in truth, however unpopular, truth is included in those defenses. Those concerned that they could be criminalized for the repugnant or offensive ideas fail to understand a crucial distinction in the law, as the Supreme Court of Canada has explained. So basically, according to the legal experts in Canada, they are not compelling you to say anything. So no, this is not compelled speech. They are not forcing you to say pronouns if you don't want to, and you would not be fined in jail simply for mislabeling somebody. And here's the craziest part. These laws have already been on the books in all of Canada for years. In fact, where Jordan Peterson lives, this law has already been on the book for 5 years. This was already the law. All Bill C-16 did was make it federally the law. These same exact statutes have been on the books in Ontario, Canada, where Jordan Peterson lives and teaches for 5 years now. And not once in the 5 years has anybody been affected the way Jordan Peterson claims they would be. In fact, it has already been the law in certain parts of Canada for 15 years, and not one single person's speech has been compelled to call a transgender person anything against their will. And this law has already been federally in place in all of Canada for over a year. Once again, not a single person treated the way Jordan Peterson claimed they would be. He basically came out, misrepresented the law, and then played the victim, like somebody was trying to force him to do something that no one was actually trying to force him to do. Once again, the law had already been in effect for 5 years where he lived, and it had never affected him in any way whatsoever. But suddenly, he saw an opportunity to put himself in the spotlight, and the narrative became, this is just a bunch of crazy social justice warriors who just want to shut him down for his free speech. He's this hero free speech warrior, and these evil lefties are trying to get rid of him over it. And that's the narrative that most of his fans are aware of.
And the problem is freedom of speech. I've never seen Peterson skillfully talk about the truth of the situation around what's going on with transgenderism. It doesn't seem like he really has a clear perspective on it. He's just like, don't compel my speech. He's not making distinctions about what's actually healthy for people, even though he's a psychologist who should probably have a professional opinion on something like this. He's not concerned with other people's psychological health. He's concerned with his own compelled speech. So is this an integral perspective? Like, what quadrant are we talking about?
Forcing unconscious bias retraining and political correctness, and what he saw happening with that, and the nightmare of Bill C-16 threw him up on the net and went viral. The main cause of that, in my opinion, is that it's these orange liberal values of equal opportunity that were getting crushed between the extreme far left of green and the strong far right of ethnocentric amber.
I do think that Peterson is a really good voice for a healthy orange and blue structure. If you're a traditional modern person, Peterson is the man. Peterson is a good role model. And the fact that he's also got some green ideas that help you to maybe start to plant that transrational seed, like maybe some of this mythology that I've been indoctrinated into isn't literally true, he's great. If I was talking to a person who was at a traditional and modern stage, especially a young man, I would definitely recommend some Jordan Peterson. But if you're a postmodern thinker or trying to get into integral, Jordan Peterson is not going to be helpful. He cannot make these distinctions. He does not have an integral perspective. Again, including other perspectives doesn't make you integral. It's how you include them.
That also is an attack on free speech in the worst possible way.
This idea of compelled speech or free speech, it reminds me of one of my favorite Nietzsche quotes, which is a great example of this transrational view or this construct awareness, where he says, "What then is truth? A vast mobile army of metaphors, metonyms, and anthropomorphisms."
In short, a sum of human relations which have been enhanced, transposed, and embellished poetically and rhetorically, and which after long use seem firm, canonical, and obligatory to a people. Truths are illusions about which one has forgotten that is what they are. Metaphors, which are worn out and without sensuous power. Coins, which have lost their pictures and now matter only as metal, no longer as coins. We still do not know where the urge for truth comes from, for as of yet we have heard only of the obligation imposed by society that it should exist. To be truthful means using the customary metaphors in moral terms. The obligation to lie according to fixed convention, to lie, heard like in a style obligatory for all.
In other words, to even speak language at all, to say evolution should be called evolution or the atom should be called the atom, that's all compelled speech. If you want to talk, you have to play along. And Jordan Peterson's whole thing is that whatever society decides, whatever rises to the top must be true and thus good because it's popular. This is his whole naturalistic fallacy.
You step outside of the guidelines of your culture at your own peril.
So it should be right along with his perspective that if society votes it up to the top, then it must be the good way to go.
This is where I'm going to sound like a postmodernist, which I really hate.
Jordan Peterson, like most postmodernists, is constantly living in performative self-contradiction, constantly caught up in hypocrisy, constantly having problems with integrity.
The Western Enlightenment was emphasizing was what the French philosophers called the system de la nature, the great whole interlocking system as a whole. John Locke actually called it the great interlocking order. The second most common idea in the Western Enlightenment was the great chain of being. It's the single most widely adopted overall philosophy that the larger percentage of sensitive, educated men and women have adopted throughout virtually all of our civilizations, up to and including the Western Enlightenment.
Wilbur talking about the great chain of being here reminds me of this idea of all of the world being mythology and us participating within the myth that we get from Joseph Campbell. By the way, if you like Jordan Peterson, you are going to really like Joseph Campbell. You should go to Netflix, watch his series, The Power of Myth, and then watch the Integral Review Live series where Alyosha and I do a talk on each one of the episodes. It's really good stuff.
And there are actually some studies of those kinds of patriarchal cultures that showed quality of life was much less for men than it was for women. And those were roles that both of them were stuck with.
I think Ken Wilber does a really good job here of putting this battle of the sexes thing in context. I agree with Wilber about this stuff, and I actually think he articulates these issues a whole lot better than Peterson does.
You just mentioned male and female, and that's something that Peterson has been criticized for quite a lot, for equating the masculine with order and the feminine with chaos. This is a theological point, and maybe it's a simplified theological point. What do you make of that?
It's not my favorite aspect of what he does. I can agree with the importance of order and chaos, and that these are two of the very, very fundamental dualisms that this manifest world is made of.
Overly simplistic dualities.
And he doesn't just identify, he doesn't say female is chaos and male is order. He says female is symbolic of. It doesn't make it much better, though. I don't find that a terribly compelling piece of information.
When you create these kinds of binaries, I know when I was first kind of realizing this sort of idea of duality and unity, yin and yang, and Star of David, and even Joseph Campbell talks about the binary nature of reality. But when you start lining up all of these binaries as if all of the different opposites line up with each other, like heaven and hell, and man and woman, and you start being like, oh, woman and hell and chaos, and when you start equating all of what you would maybe consider dark or negative things together, then you do start to get some of these bad ideas, like, oh, the woman is the path of hell and chaos. And yeah, that is violent and wrong and messed up and unskillful and all that. When you start lining up these binaries and then conflating them all into each other, you can get into some serious confusion and some serious problems. That's why this simplistic dualistic thinking is not really good when it comes to actually metasystemic perspectives. It's good basic poetry and symbolism, and it can be good to lead to some insights, but within those dark and light sides, there's a bunch of nuanced perspectives, and of course there's the shadow element in the light side and the light elements in the dark side. And so it's not as simple as these basic dualities. It can be really a problematic way of thinking about things. I think one of the main themes that we see at Green is the pre-trans confusion, but also the far-sighted mishmashing. You have far-sighted mishmashing where you take a bunch of things that look or sound similar and you squish them together into one thing that might often be like this new kind of weird hybrid. And then there's another problem of conflation where you go, oh, all this other stuff kind of looks like my thing, and so all this other stuff is really saying this thing that's my thing. Both of these things are the two main problems that happen at Green. Wilber and Peterson both do a little bit of both. They both run into both of these problems a little bit. They're very common problems at Green, this bad integration. There's healthy actual integral stages making these distinctions, and then there's these still green problems with bad integration. And as we know, people are not just simply at a stage in a rigid kind of way, that there's this spectrum of unfolding, and so some lines reach higher and usually the cognitive line runs higher. So we're seeing that in Peterson, is that his cognitive line is running ahead, but there's still a lot of work to be done. There's still a lot of shadow work to be done. There's still a lot of issues down the spiral that will result in those better distinctions to actually help him to move fully into those stages. And Wilber has ignored a lot of his shadow too. He hasn't really been very good about engaging with his critics and dealing with some real peer review on these kinds of subjects. He just acts like no one's qualified to be critical of him. If you disagree with him, you must just be immature. So he definitely has some issues with bad integration too, that he should really know better, because he does know better. He specifically makes these distinctions, but then still tends to favor his bias. So we all have our issues, our areas where we still need work, and Ken Wilber is no exception to this.
People that aren't really sophisticated on these things are really misinterpreting what he's saying anyway.
Now, I do think that a lot of people who criticize Jordan Peterson are doing it from a left-leaning perspective where they are getting caught up in what we would call pre-trans confusion themselves, which is like they're confusing post-conventional criticisms with pre-conventional criticisms. I think he has a more nuanced view than some of his critics want to give him credit for. People want to demonize people that they want to reject, and that's definitely happening with Peterson as well. So not all of his critics are great critics, but definitely I do think that a lot of the things that Peterson Peterson says are problematic, and the ways that he says them are often not as skillful as they could be. So that's definitely an issue.
We have this leading edge green, which is broken mostly, not allowing us to even discuss these issues, because everything simply has to be equal outcome, and if it's not, there's discrimination. There's sexism, there's racism, there's something going on. It's not that those aren't occurring, it's just those aren't only occurring.
This is what I was saying about people who are postmodernists on the left wanting to reduce Jordan to just phobic, racist, sexist, what have you. A lot of that stuff is overblown. Now, does he have some of those kind of tendencies? Maybe so. I have heard some things that sound certainly problematic.
I know how to stand up to a man who's unfairly trespassing against me. We talk, we argue, we push, and then it becomes physical. If we move beyond the boundaries of civil discourse, we know what the next step is. Okay, that's forbidden in discourse with women. When men are talking to each other in any serious manner, that underlying threat of physicality is always there, especially if it's a real conversation, and it keeps the thing civilized to some degree. You know, if you're talking to a man who wouldn't fight with you under any circumstances whatsoever, then you're talking to someone to whom you have absolutely no respect. There's a woman in Toronto who's been organizing this movement, let's say, against me, and she's quite offensive, you might say. She compared us to Nazis, for example. But I'm defenseless against that kind of female insanity, because the techniques that I would use against a man who is employing those tactics are forbidden to me. I don't see any regulating force for that terrible femininity, and it seems to me to be invading the culture and undermining the masculine power of the culture in a way that's, I think, fatal.
You could always excuse that by saying, well, that's not real communism, which is the sort of statement that should immediately get you punched in the nose hard enough to knock you out, as far as I'm concerned. So,
here's a rule. How about no makeup in the workplace? Why do you make your lips red? Because they turn red during sexual arousal. That's why. Why do you put rouge on your cheeks? Same reason. How about high heels? They're there to exaggerate sexual attractiveness. That's what high heels do. They tilt your pelvis forward so your hips stick out, and they tighten up your calf muscles. They're a sexual display. Now, I'm not saying that people shouldn't use sexual displays in the workplace. I'm not saying that.
I'm not saying that.
I'm not saying that. Here's a rule. How about no makeup in the workplace? But I am saying that that is what they're doing, and that is what they're doing. The Maoists put everybody in uniforms to stop that sort of thing from happening. Men wear uniforms. That's the way why they wear suits.
A serious woman who does not want sexual harassment in the workplace, do you feel like if she wears makeup in the workplace that she is somewhat being critical?
Yeah. I do think that. This means rejecting, among other things, the misbegotten idea of casual sexual gratification. Sex is either the impulsive, short-term gratification of a domineering biological instinct, or the union of two conscious spirits taking responsibility for what they are doing. The former is simply not commensurate with the demands of an advanced civilization, which requires the adoption of responsibility above all for its preservation, maintenance, and expansion. Now, with regards to gay marriage specifically, that's a really tough one for me. I'm concerned about the undermining of traditional modes of being. I'm concerned about the undermining of traditional modes of being, including marriage, which has technically and historically been a union between a man and a woman fundamentally for the purpose of raising children in an optimal and stable environment. Traditional modes of being, traditional modes of being, traditional modes of being. What are your thoughts about gay people raising children? I mean, you have problems, right? If you're both of the same sex, then you're going to have the problem of how to provide the proper model. Kids in intact heterosexual families where the father is present do way better.
I think a lot of where he's coming from with some of that kind of stuff is from a place of good intention, not necessarily from a place of hate. But he still winds up giving people who are hateful, reasonable sounding ways of hating on people. And so I can see why people who care about racism and sexism and phobia and stuff like that can be concerned with the voice of someone like Jordan Peterson contributing to some of those negative conversations. But yeah, again, having these conversations is how we figure things out, how we grow, and there's going to be development, which means that we need to be able to have these conversations and not just shut down with some kind of dogmatic idea like, no, you're not allowed to think that way. If you think that way, you think that way. And the only way you're going to stop thinking that way is if somebody argues you out of it. So we have to be able to have the conversation.
If I have some shadow material, it runs in the direction that Jordan Peterson does. The postmodern theorists, and very angry making for me. It really was infuriating.
You share his anger?
Very much.
Definitely, Wilber is also very critical of Green, so it would make sense that he would resonate with Peterson around a lot of this criticism and that he would be hearing, oh, this is integral.
The things he attacks in postmodernism are all the extremist, regressive, outrageously idiotic aspects of it, but he still uses some of its core ideas.
But a lot of people say he doesn't transcend and include Green. You think he does?
I think he does. The part of Green that he doesn't like is the extremist, identity politics, neo-Marxist aspects.
He clearly doesn't include the healthy deconstruction of green, nor does he seem to have a healthy relationship with the progressive civil rights aspect of green. One might argue these are the most healthy and important parts of green. He hasn't deconstructed his Christianity, he hasn't deconstructed the society, he hasn't deconstructed the self or the ego, and he came on the scene fighting against civil rights, pretending like it had something to do with freedom of speech. Just ask yourself what are the most healthy parts of green, and then ask yourself if Jordan Peterson is in touch with that, and it seems like the answer is no.
How can he be integral when he is so anti-green?
Even this guy knows.
He is making use of those capacities, although he's also transcended and included. So he's using capacities that will encompass the limitations of having just that stage.
I do think Peterson has integral intuitions. I think he has integral insights. I don't think he has any of the language or clear distinctions or consistent methodology that's actually an integral perspective. He's like on the cusp between green and integral. He's still figuring it out. All right, let's break down a recap.
Because he's clearly an integral thinker.
That's very easy to claim, but I don't see the evidence of it.
He has an enormous amount of respect for objective science. But what he realizes is that there are these other validity claims that aren't just objective, material, exterior truth.
When it comes to quadrants, does Peterson include all the quadrants? Well, kind of, but not in a skillful way with an integral methodology. Ken Hovind includes all 4 quadrants. Ken Hovind roots a lot of his stuff in science.
Biblical view of creation is certainly scientific. It makes predictions, okay?
But he's still a fundamentalist.
He would start interpreting religion as is archetypal, and he's just moving through the Bible and doing that.
Okay, and sure, maybe when it comes to Ken Hovind, he doesn't think of the Bible in an archetypal kind of way. But Jordan Peterson doesn't consistently think of these things in an archetypal kind of way either. So that's a problem. In terms of stages,
the one area where I would like to see Peterson give more attention is growth hierarchies, in terms of some specific stages that they go through, the developmental viewpoint. But that never gets mentioned with Jordan.
He doesn't really talk about stages. Okay, so there's a point against him. In terms of lines, well,
if you look at all of the sort of dozen or so multiple intelligences, and again, if you don't like that concept, I know Peterson doesn't like that.
He doesn't really have that healthy of an integration of lines. He wants to reduce everything to the cognitive line. So there's a problem. That's going to be a mark against him. In terms of states,
Peterson is perfectly aware of waking up. He's absolutely aware of it, but he doesn't really talk about that.
It does seem like he's aware of states, and he's done psychedelics, but he doesn't really seem to have had an existential awakening or a transpersonal view. And he certainly isn't teaching about that or encouraging anyone in that direction. So not only does it seem like he doesn't really want to encourage his students to take psychedelics, I also haven't heard him encourage his students to take on any kind of meditation or state training practice. And that would be really helpful to them. Ken Wilber and Peterson probably disagree about states, but Peterson definitely includes them in his map of reality. So we'll give him half a point there. And types.
The big 5-factor analysis. I totally agree with that. It's part of what we call types. It's an actual ingredient of the integral framework. We totally include that.
Sure, he includes types. Okay, so
it's meta-systemic. It introduces a 4th-person perspective, which just means it can reflect on the universal 3rd-person perspectives that Orange brought into existence and that were so profound for the Western world. But a 4th-person perspective is a capacity to actually reflect on that and make certain critical announcements about it. Peterson does that. He's fully aware of doing that. He's using that meta-systemic capacity. But he also has a capacity for paradigmatic and cross-paradigmatic thinking.
I agree that Peterson has a meta-systemic perspective. That's what happens at Green. But I don't really see any ideas that are paradigmatic or cross-paradigmatic. Someone's going to have to point to those for me.
He doesn't just reflect on those things. He tries to tie them together. He wants to integrate science and religion. And so he is making use of those capacities. He has access to paradigmatic and cross-paradigmatic stuff.
It's great to want to integrate religion and science, but that doesn't make you a cross-paradigmatic thinker. It doesn't make you integrally informed. It doesn't even mean that you are doing it with good integral standards. Again, Ken Hovind also wants to integrate religion and science, and just like Jordan Peterson, he conveniently ignores science where it comes into conflict with his belief system. I'm not really seeing an integral perspective here. What I'm seeing is a really smart green Christian. It's interesting, one of the things that I've noticed around this whole problem is people being like, well, this guy's integral, right? Or Peterson is integral. Here's what I think. If you are really integrally informed, then you understand the lessons and the pitfalls at every stage, and you probably also know about several different variations on the theme at every stage. And so you can see, okay, Peterson, he's got this idea. It's at this level, and it's a good one. He's got this idea at this level, and it's not such a good one. Okay, look at this one. Look at this one. This is good. This is not so good. And you can see where his ideas are at clearly. And you can say, this man does not even reside at an integral altitude. He's at these conventional stages. All of his ideas are within this conventional altitude. Unless you can point to his integral ideas and really say why he's integral, then you're not getting it right yourself. And not only does this show that you're not getting it right yourself, but probably that you yourself are not really fully integral, which is part of what we're seeing here with even Ken Wilber. And for those who are going, oh my goodness, how can you be so arrogant as to think that you know more about this stuff than Wilber? Well, because I believe in this great chain of being, this idea that we stand on the shoulders of giants. I think that the students of Wilber who come along later and get to learn everything he has to teach are going to be better than Wilber. This is to be expected. So yeah, I respect Wilber as one of the founding fathers of integral, and I think he mostly gets it right. I think the ways he gets it wrong, he ends up breaking his own rules in favor of his bias. So it's not that he's not a smart guy or that he doesn't know what he's talking about. It's just that he doesn't act it out perfectly or apply his methods perfectly. Let's continue.
When the person sat down and wrote Moses parted the Red Sea, they didn't have some deep symbolic meaning to that. They meant this guy named Moses stood next to the Red Sea and he went whack and the sea parted and they walked across. That's what he meant.
This is where I actually disagree with Wilber. I don't think that all mythology is written with a literal intention, or even that most of it is. The story of Moses is a hybrid of different stories of like Sargon the Great, some Egyptian spells, Hammurabi's code. I think you really have to study the mythology in depth to be able to make those kinds of distinctions. And also, just because it wasn't the original intention doesn't mean that you can't find poetic value in there.
And the literal meaning is what the original writers meant. That's what they were saying.
That's not always true if you're looking at traditions like the Gnostics or something like that. They didn't take their stories literally, and the Gnostics are the original Christians. Gnosis was an experience that couldn't be put into words. It wasn't something that you could explicitly talk about or tell to another person. So as a mystery school, they would tell you stories and do ceremonies and things to try to give you an experience. And the Jesus myth is one of these stories. It's a metaphor. It's poetry. And so to say that it wasn't the original intention is wrong. It's not true.
One of the things that I think will help Peterson's explanation of religion is if he does look at these different stages of religion, the actual beliefs as they unfolded, and not simply sort of put them all together as a single narrative and then try to read the existential underlying rules for all of them. That's a little bit dicey if you really are looking at different ways that human beings develop through their spiritual understanding.
He's absolutely right about this. If you're going to have a system of integration when it comes to these myths, you can't try to reduce it all back down to Christianity or just intuit some kind of overarching metaphysics. They really do have to be understood in a developmental context. So when you understand the psychological and the historical both in a developmental context, you have a lot better understanding of the overarching patterns and themes and how all these things have come to be and the difference between a magical mythical read of symbolism, the rational historical literal scientific read of symbolism, and a more philosophical, metaphorical, poetic, transrational kind of read of these symbols.
To get the most out of this film, we'll need to introduce a little integral terminology. At the core of integral theory,
you can always tell who's freshman integral because I think all of us probably start calling it integral, but more seasoned integralists call it integral. It's like when I used to live in Nevada, you could tell the people who were not from Nevada because they called it Nevada. Same kind of thing.
If they're healthily integrated, they support each other. But each of them can believe that their way of looking at the world is the only true way, and then they are mutually exclusive. For Wilber, the incomprehension between these worldviews is what's causing many of the worst excesses of the culture wars.
The graphics are actually kind of cool. Here's the problem. It's not that these stages need to continue to exist in their current forms. It's that you need to have healthy versions of every stage.
Since everybody has to go through all of these, then an enlightened society would include ways to help us do that.
Every worldview has truth to it. Every worldview has good things about it. We're saying that each of these stages of development need to have a healthy expression. That's a little bit different than saying that all of these worldviews need to be integrated. Every stage of development is important, but there's a bunch of different ways each stage of development can be, is, and will be expressed in time. And it's not like we necessarily need to be super attached to any of those particular expressions. It's more about what are the lessons, what are the values at each stage, and how can we get them? What are the pitfalls and problems in each stage, and how can we avoid them?
And green didn't transcend and include orange, transcended and repressed orange. That's the definition of pathology.
We usually develop some kind of a shadow around the stage that we just grew out of. Kind of like the lesson that you just learned is front and center in your awareness. What you're subject to in this stage becomes an object to you in the next stage. So if you just came out of religion into the rational stage, of course, we see how atheists are towards people who are religious. We see how freshman vegans are to people who eat meat. We see how postmodernists are to the modernists. We see how Ken Wilber and other integralists are to the postmodernists. We're critical of the stage that we just came out of, and this is a healthy part of growth because this is how the spiral keeps moving. It's this antithetical dialectical pressure that moves through time where we grow out of one stage and then we pull back on them to try to get them to grow up more too. Ken Wilber says there are two main factors in being healthy at whatever stage of development that you're at. The first factor is that you include all four quadrants, and the second factor is that you do work to lift up the previous stage of development or the previous stages of development. So you're actively involved in the spiral. So I think we need to be careful saying that there's not transcending and including actually going on here. I think another thing that might be going on is that because we're at a point in our cultural development where green is becoming a new conventional idea, that green almost becomes like a type of dogma. And people who are brought up in these homes with parents who have green postmodern philosophies get taught postmodern ideas as dogma. And so people who are holding this no judgment idea, they haven't actually matured enough up to green to understand why no judgment. They're just saying no judgment. And because why? Because that you're not supposed to judge, because you're not supposed to. So that's a dogmatic. You can't just judge the quality of the idea because certain people will grab ideas in the zeitgeist and use them as shields for their egoic or traditional ideas. Don't judge me. You're not supposed to judge. Judging's bad. Do they really care about judging, or are they just trying to protect their ego? Are they really mature up to green? A lot of times, no. So there's both the issue with having a shadow with people who are at the stage you just grew out of, as well as this issue of ideas floating around in the zeitgeist that people at lower stages might grab in service of whatever their values are. A little bit complicated, but when you dig into the details of this theory, you can actually see a lot more of what's going on in the world, and you can start to describe it better and really figure out what's going on. Like with Jordan Peterson, where it's not so easy, it's not so cut and dry to figure out where on the spiral he's at, because he has ideas scattered throughout the conventional stages of development. So where is he coming from? It's hard to tell. This is why an understanding of the nuances really helps us to get into the details and see what's going on.
Above these levels, Wilber says, is another level called integral, or second tier.
Also notice they've reduced stages 7 and 8 to both being integral second tier.
What's starting to take over that leading edge is second tier, because again, we have about 5%, 6% there. When it gets close to 10%, then it's officially going to be a leading edge, and there's going to be some sort of tipping point. We're going to see that happening.
We've been hearing about this tipping point for so long. Maybe the Sam Harris, Jordan Peterson talks around this stuff is the hint of this tipping point starting to happen. I want to see it happen. I want to help it happen. So this is one of the things that I'm working on, trying to both correct the problems that Ken and some of these other integral thinkers have had in the past, and also take up the good stuff and carry the torch into the future and hopefully have this integral emergentist revolutionary, with a capital E for evolutionary, revolutionary movement. That's what we need, is that integral emergentist revolutionary movement. There's a lot of integral, but not all of it is emergentist integral, and definitely not all of it is revolutionary, interested in an actual movement. But if you are interested in these things, definitely like and subscribe and dig in deeper to my content, because that's what I'm all about.
Doesn't stop any of them from having very specific existential anger issues at things that they see and think that are wrong?
Anybody who's awake probably has some kind of existential anger issues. If you don't have existential anger issues, you probably don't care enough. You probably are privileged in some kind of way where it doesn't actually show up as a problem in your life affecting you. If you're in it, it's hard not to feel the weight of the world pressing down on you and result in some kind of heartbreak for progress. And I think passion is what we need to see a little bit more of. Less of this kind of passive, oh, I just meditate and I realize the whole world's an illusion kind of stuff. We need to see more people who are passionate. Again, this is where the revolutionary aspect comes in, the revolutionary movement, not just this passive kind of, well, you know, things are going to happen. It's inevitable. We need to make things happen. The world needs us.
But then you're allowed to get angry with various aspects of any of these things. And that anger might be what you could call just sort of a pure, entirely justified anger, or it could be some of your own shadow material. Nobody ever ultimately escapes all shadow material. It's always there.
And also, just because you have shadow material doesn't mean you're wrong. So it could be totally justified and totally right and also shadow material. So it's like if you have trauma coming from a particular stage, like I know I do, I have shadow and trauma, especially associated with traditional and modern stages, and green too, but mostly the trauma, I think, for me happened around blue and a little bit in the orange. So I both can appreciate a lot of mythology and poetry and tradition and ceremony, and I understand the reason and the importance of things like religion and how it can be really healthy and good in people's development and in their life. But at the same time, there's definitely a part of me that's angry about the way that we just let kids be raised in cults. And it's like, well, I don't know, the parents can decide. It's like, why are we letting the parents decide? Why is that the good thing to do? I think we should protect kids from this stuff. I feel like it stifled my development. I feel like I was lied to by people who pretended to know things that they don't really know. That's why also I'm super critical of Wilber, because he also resonates with this major shadow issue I have around people claiming like they know things that they don't actually know and pretending like they know things they don't know. It's a major issue with integrity. It really resonates deep with me. It's one of my major issues with him, my major gripes. Point being, just because you have a shadow around something doesn't mean that that something isn't harmful or problematic and needs to be changed. Just because you've been traumatized by religion or by capitalism or by postmodernism doesn't mean that your criticisms of religion or capitalism or postmodernism aren't totally valid and true. When it comes to these shadow issues, part of the way that we can more skillfully deal with it is to try to understand whatever the situation is in the larger context. Like, am I being triggered by this person's traditional ideas, but it's actually really good for them and really important for them in their life? And maybe it's a major upgrade from where they were before that, and I should understand their development in context and be like, okay, you're gonna do that, you're gonna be there, that's what you're doing, that's where you're at. I think it makes more sense to get angry or upset when people should know better or should be doing better or close to a transitionary point, but they're still just like clinging on to some kind of past thing. Sometimes the anger or like a challenge can break that attachment a little bit. Sometimes it can make people grab on harder, but if a person knows better or has ideas at a higher stage, it can be something like anger that can shake things up to move things along a little bit, especially if it's really pointed and accurate anger and it's not just frustration and rage and name calling. If it's real heat but not fire.
And green didn't transcend and include orange, transcended and repressed orange. That's the definition of pathology.
You know what, though? That's Ken Wilber's problem, too. He ignores a lot of science that disagrees with his perspective and favors some of his spiritual Eastern bias and then corrupts the whole project. So Ken Wilber is not immune to these criticisms either. I think that in a lot of ways, even though he can make a lot of integral distinctions, he commits pre-trans fallacies and has certain issues that really mess up his whole worldview.
That's a literal koan. That's not a symbolic thing. There's something in you right now that existed prior to your parents' birth, and it's that sense of I amness. The journey of enlightenment, if you want to put it in a simplified form, is the journey that moves you from your empirical self, anything that you can see or know about yourself, any object, to pure awareness, pure self, your true self, the self that cannot be made an object, but is the space in which all of this is arising. That's a literal koan. That's not a symbolic thing.
Joseph Campbell, probably the recent era's greatest mythologer and interpretive mythology, and somebody I certainly cut my teeth on. I was a great admirer of his and a really extraordinary work that he did. He used to very, very vehemently, actually, say that there's really sort of two types of mythology, or mythology forms two different functions. He wouldn't use the terms pre-rational and trans-rational, but the way we're talking about them is the way he would talk about these two functions of mythology. And the first function is when mythology is taken to be concretely real. But what some people do, particularly educated, intelligent people like us that are trying to get some meaning in our lives, we can tend to take myths as deeply symbolic of something else. So that's a very distinguishing way to tell the difference between pre-rational myths that are taken to be concretely, literally true, and trans-rational myths as deeply symbolic.
That's a literal koan. That's not a symbolic thing. There's something in you right now that existed prior to your parents' birth, and it's that sense of I amness.
And the problem again with the pre-trans fallacy, way too many people take a lot of the pre-rational stuff and elevate it to trans-rational glory it just doesn't have.
Fundamentalist, religious believer, they don't take these things metaphorically. These are not symbols of some higher truth. These are the truth. That's a literal koan. That's not a symbolic thing.
What you talking about, Wilbur?
That's why I'm saying these little distinctions make so much of a big deal, because holding on tight to one little blue idea and trying to sneak it in will mess up your whole project. You cannot hold on to any of your biases if you really want to be an open, honest, skillful philosopher. You got to be completely open to whatever is actually good and true, and whatever proves to be the case. And if someone says, I can prove you wrong, you got to be like, all right, I'm excited to see that. That means if you're right, I'm about to learn something. So it's good. If you're really open and honest, all you'll ever be doing is learning and expanding. To say you were wrong is to admit that you're wiser now than you were before.
But the problem is you can't really measure these interior, left-hand, subjective and inner subjective realities very well. You can measure exterior matter well. And so the more science kept going forward, the more the Enlightenment ended up, almost accidentally, with an official philosophy of what's often called scientific materialism.
Here we go.
And so, yes, we believe in the whole interlocking order of nature, but only as far as you can see it in an objective, materialistic.
This is where Ken Wilber starts to bring out his normal straw man of science. Like most serious scientists that we respect, like Dawkins and Harris and Dennett and all these people, they are not these simplistic materialists like Wilber is saying. They're not reducing reality to that which you can grasp in your hand and measure. The reason Ken Wilber is going down this road is because he believes in Eastern idealism, and he basically thinks that spirit is extra stuff, not this emergent property, consciousness coming online through time, through life, through form. He thinks there's this extra stuff before the Big Bang, this being of beings. He has this religious view.
And so as you get that sense of ongoing I amness, it's no objects whatsoever. And it is absolutely infallible. You don't complicate it. If you're aware of I am, that's it. That's it. Ongoing, ever-present knowingness called I amness. And it existed now, 5 minutes ago, 5 years ago, 5 decades ago, 5 centuries ago, before the Big Bang. And before the universe was, I am. And that is the fundamental, absolute secret of the great tradition.
This dogmatic Hindu view of I amness before the Big Bang. And so he strawmans science so that way he can dismiss a lot of their perspectives in favor of his religious, biased, dogmatic idea. So this is actually the core of Wilber's problems. And you can check out my Ken Wilber Debunked series. I mean, obviously you can't debunk a person completely, and I agree with a lot of what Wilber has to say. But it's called What You Talking About, Wilber, and Episode 3 is about I amness before the Big Bang, and it explores this problem in detail. I will continue on.
It's very interwoven. It's just all exterior, objective truth. So it has no interiors.
No interiors.
There's no beauty. There's no morals.
There's no beauty
no
or morals.
Aesthetics. There's no love. There's none of that.
You think that any of these scientists are going to be like, there's no such thing as beauty or love? Like, come on. Nobody thinks this.
None of that fits into a standard systems theory. Doesn't work.
They would just say it's hard to measure.
They transcend and include. Literally, molecules go beyond atoms, but they enfold them. They actually include them. Molecules don't hate atoms. They don't oppress atoms. They don't exclude atoms. If anything, they love them. I mean, they're actually hugging them.
This is where he starts reading in interiority into things that don't have interiority. They're literally hugging them. They love them.
Love is not just a feeling, but this drive towards unity actually goes all the way back to the Big Bang.
So this sounds like fun and poetic language, and poetically, sure, but he means it literally. he seriously means this. When you listen to him talk more, you will hear it. He literally says this stuff.
So Piaget tended to focus on cognitive development. Kohlberg tended to focus on moral development. Maslow tended to focus on motivational development. Jane Loevinger focused on ego development. But the stages were essentially similar, and you could map those across all of these lines.
And one of the ways that Wilber goes really wrong with a lot of this stuff ends up corrupting the stages of development, ending up breaking up the partnership between him and Don Beck, is trying to stack Aurobindo state stages on top of Piaget to create a third tier of development using the tier language of spiral dynamics and completely divorced from the regular meta-analytical methodology of looking at a bunch of developmental psychologists who are doing a bunch of different actual scientific tests that are cross-culturally validated. He's just going to throw a mystic into the mix. I reject all of this. Ken Wilber's assumption that mystics represent the highest stages of development and the integration of Aurobindo's third-tier stages. It's yet another example of Wilber attempting to exploit the Graves model in spiral dynamics. He lacks entirely the seventh code, integral, and has no idea how, when, where each of the codes have emerged. I will gladly challenge him to a public debate, but he still hides out in his loft in Denver. The whole idea of tiers is uniquely language from our work, which he steals in order to market his. The man lacks any ethical basis when he does so. He is nothing beyond red, blue, and orange. If he wants to develop his own system, then he should do so without exploiting my lifetime of work, which he continues to do. Our seventh and now emerging eighth codes of second tier are functional, resolve real-world problems, and emerge out of life conditions, not out of some mystical realm from Eastern viewpoints which belong to those cultures, not to Western societies. The eighth code is beginning to take shape, and it will not be the sixth code, green on steroids, as many in the integral world believe. Don Beck. It totally ends up corrupting the whole thing, and then other people, like this guy Leo from actualize.org, makes a whole series of videos about spiral dynamics and shares the corrupted model. Anyways, I digress.
Integral theory represents this development as a spiral. In this film, we'll mostly be talking about amber, tribalism, ethnocentric, authoritarian, which first emerged about 5,000 years ago.
So one thing that I find to be kind of annoying is that we're talking about amber and not blue. Spiral dynamics uses the color blue, and it does this for a reason. The colors are meaningful. When you move back and forth between warm and cool colors, that means something. The colors represent something. The warm colors are individualistic and the cool colors are communal. So when Wilber changes the spiral to try to match the rainbow or something like that, he's just messing with other people's maps, and he doesn't help them in doing so. Also, integral is yellow, not teal. This is not the spiral dynamics map. Wilber has perverted that map. Don Beck is pissed because Wilber is perverting his map and going around and spreading perverted versions all over the place.
Constant perverted thoughts.
It's some of the things that he leaves out. I find this a little bit interesting because he's clearly an integral thinker.
How is he coming to this conclusion that he's an integral thinker? Ken Wilber loves to do this. Other people have been critical of this in the past.
I would love to see him cut the socializing and the endless, I call this celebrity and I call that celebrity. I talk them into integral. And in the end, we agree so much. Why? Disagree. That brings the clash and the insight and also the qualification.
He never debates or argues with anybody within the community or really deals with any of the criticisms in public or anything like that. Off on his own, he'll be critical of somebody, but not to their face and not in like a real debate kind of situation. If you check out Integral Life content, what you'll find is that Ken Wilber loves to have people on, say how much we agree about everything, and then convince them that they're integral already. This is a good sales tactic, but it's not really honest. And it's also a great way for Ken Wilber to basically tell Jordan Peterson's fans, if you agree with Peterson, that must mean that you agree with me, and you're probably integral, so you should buy into this. This is a thing that he does a lot. He goes around and he tells people you're already integral as a way to get them to buy into his philosophy. Part of this is kind of true because you want to appeal to people's highest nature, and it can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So it's not necessarily such a terrible thing to do, except for it dumbs down the standards of the community because people think that they don't have to do the work to actually learn the theory to really become integral. They just say, oh, well, I already am integral. It's like this vibe, you know? It's like you can tell who's conscious and who's not. And so then all of the green plus stages just gets convoluted into this like, oh, it's all integral, which is basically a lot of new age, even postmodern thinkers and stuff like that. Actually, I don't really think that Jordan Peterson's fans would be hugely into a lot of the stuff in integral. Jordan Peterson is really Christian. He swings heavy in that direction, which gets a lot of the conservative stuff going. Ken Wilber is really Buddhist. He's into the Eastern ideas. So their cosmologies are different. They're not going to agree about religion or healthy integration of religion. Like Ken Wilber's definitely going to say that Peterson leaves out meditation.
Peterson is perfectly aware of waking up, but he doesn't really talk about that.
A lot of the integral community is actually new agey, postmodern, touchy-feely, woo-woo types. I would say about 30, 40, maybe 50% of people who say they're into integral actually know the theory, actually can make some of those distinctions. Few of them really know the stuff and apply it in their life. So I think there are a couple problems with this sales tactic of telling everybody that they're integral. It gets people in the door, but it can dumb down the standards and dumb down the community and slow down progress. It confuses the community. It's a problem.
So in terms of any number of individuals in the dark web who, again, most of them, I think, are operating with integral cognitive capacities.
No, a lot of these people are not. Some of them are, like Sam Harris, I would say, is one of the really leading edge people. But then there's people like Ben Shapiro, who is super conventional blue-orange. Just because he doesn't fit into like the normal boxes doesn't make him integral.
His argument with Sam Harris is Harris focuses exactly on what they're saying. And he says, and that's wrong. And so he'll actually criticize Moses really parting the Red Sea. And he'll say, that's just false. We don't need it. Get rid of it. Sam is doing it because he's not an eliminative materialist, but he does still tend to kind of reduce everything to third-person determined causality. And there's no room for freedom in that at all. And so he'll take all of those actual literal statements of religion leading up to science, and he'll say all of that is just flat out bloody wrong. It has no business being there. It was a stupid mistake we made from the beginning. It's still around. We've got to get rid of it. Nothing good.
This is just a straw man. If you actually listen to their conversations, this is not Sam Harris's actual point or argument.
You said, I still considered the world's religions to be mere intellectual ruins maintained at enormous economic and social cost, but now I understood that important psychological truths could be found in the rubble. Well, I'm trying to find the important psychological truths in the rubble. We have to decide also if we agree about that. Are there important psychological truths to be found in the rubble?
Absolutely.
Sam believes that what should happen is that the poetic and fictional domain should be supplanted by the rational domain.
Let me just close the loop there. Not quite. I think we need poetry and fiction, and there's more to engaging with reality than being a scientist in a white lab coat. But we need to be able to clearly distinguish fact from fantasy or fact from the imagination. And we want to be rigorous there and rational there. It's not that there's no place for mere creativity.
Let me see if I can sharpen up what my concern actually is here, because it's not even true to say that I think you need to get rid of the Jesus story. I don't even think there's something problematic with orienting your life around the Jesus story. I think that can be reclaimed. A tarot reading can be truly powerful. This is built on something, right? This is not just a massive example of self-deception on the part of people reading and people getting their cards read. These cards can seem prescient. I could give you all a reading right now, and 95% of you would find what the cards would say to be relevant to your lives. There's a way of understanding the utility of using a device like this and the real effect it has on you. I mean, if I turn over the cards and ask you to look at your life in this moment as though for the first time through this lens, of course it's going to be valid. My main concern is that at no point do you have to lie to yourself about your state of knowledge about the mechanism.
He recognizes that some of this stuff could be useful, but he worries about the ways that it can get into dogmatism or the particular harmful ideas of a tradition. And he doesn't hear Peterson making skillful distinctions around this stuff to help to protect from these concerns that he has. So he's totally willing to say, hey, if you want to see the Jesus story as poetry and the metaphor of the Christ, and I should be the Christ, and I should see myself as Jesus and live like that in the world, like if that's useful to you and you can do that in a way that's not superstitious or harmful and that doesn't get caught up in these bad ideas, then he's totally fine with that. It's just that he wants to hear Peterson say that this stuff isn't literally true to make some real distinctions around this stuff and quit trying to weasel around it.
And he's altering it from that third-person deterministic scientific sense. And Peterson is always going to, wait a minute, there are these interior, left-hand, subjective and intersubjective realities.
Again, Peterson is schooling Harris on intersubjective realities. No, Harris is schooling Peterson on how to put those intersubjective realities into context. Harris knows very well that there are subjective and intersubjective realities.
You're so dismissive of subjective experience.
I'm not remotely
which has given rise
dismissive
to
of it.
poetry, to music, to art. So dismissive of subjectivity.
There's nothing more important than subjectivity. The changes in our conscious experience are all we care about. Values are a certain kind of fact. They are facts about the well-being of conscious creatures. One of the problems we have in discussing consciousness scientifically is that consciousness is irreducibly subjective, and we can't reduce the experiential side to talk of information processing and neurotransmitters and states of the brain. People want to do this. Someone like Francis Crick said famously, "You're nothing but a pack of neurons." That misses the fact that half of the reality we're talking about is the qualitative experiential side. So when you're trying to study human consciousness by looking at states of the brain, all you can do is correlate experiential changes with changes in brain states. But no matter how tight these correlations become, that never gives you license to throw out the first-person experiential side. That'd be analogous to saying that if you just flipped a coin long enough, you would realize it had only one side. And now it's true you can be committed to talking about just one side. You can say that heads being up is just a case of tails being down, but that doesn't actually reduce one side of reality to the other. We have very strong third-person, quote, objective measures of things like anxiety and fear. Bring someone to the lab, they say they're feeling fear, you can scan their brains with fMRI and see that their amygdala response is heightened, measure the sweat on their palms and see that there's an increased galvanic skin response, check their blood cortisol and see that it's spiking. These now are considered objective third-person measures of fear. But if half the people came into the lab tomorrow and said they were feeling fear and showed none of these signs, and they said they were completely calm when their cortisol spiked and when their palms started to sweat, these objective measures would no longer be reliable measures of fear. So the cash value of a change in physiology is still a change in the first-person conscious side of things, and we're inevitably going to rely on people's subjective reports to understand whether our correlations are accurate. So the hope that we're going to talk about consciousness shorn of any kind of qualitative, internal, experiential language, I think is a false one. So we have to understand both sides of it, subjective and objective.
So when Harris talks about facts, he's including interior facts.
So what Sam really doesn't like is magic and mythic views of ultimate concern. He doesn't like them in Islam. He doesn't like them in Christianity. He doesn't like them wherever he sees them.
It's not that he doesn't like them. It's that he wants to see society outgrow them. He wants to see real distinctions made in society to make our culture more healthy. He wants to outgrow the unhealthy expressions at these stages of development.
It doesn't make sense for the right reason, and that's why it's not a reliable guide given other changes in the world. But with everything changing, you want to be making sense for the right reason. Useful fictions have to be retired at a certain point. Useful truths stay true. The doors leading out of this kind of fundamentalism don't open from the inside. They get bashed open from the outside. And it's humanism and it's secularism and it's scientific rationality that has exerted such pressure now for multiple centuries. That's why we're not encountering the Christians of the 14th century on a daily basis.
And he's right, because we are more mature than this now. We do need to be making better distinctions. We do need to have a better culture. Actually, Harris is really good about not just not liking religious ideas wherever he sees them. He definitely makes clear distinctions where he says Christian ideas are bad because they are bad for things like stem cell research, whereas that's not so much of a problem with Islam, but Islamists have all these problems with suicide bombs and whatnot. And the more extreme dogmatic fundamentalist you are as a Jainist, the actual less violent you'll be, the less you'll want to hurt something. So he's not just equally against all religious ideas. He understands that certain traditions and certain religious ideas within those traditions are more harmful than others. He's looking at these things in a larger context. He's not coming from this simplistic religion is bad kind of perspective.
At the time that they existed, it was in a sense the best we could do. But today, yes, you can do better in many cases using a type of scientific third-person approach. But there still are all these interiors, and they still have various rules and patterns that govern them. And you can't get those just through an objective view of science. And that's where Sam is always holding out.
It's not that Sam is holding out. It's not that he denies interiority. He's a neuroscientist. He has done all kinds of studies on religion where he correlates interior phenomenological reports to measurements in the exterior in people's brains.
I was in the middle of my PhD in neuroscience where I was studying belief. I was actually scanning people's brains and studying the difference between believing and disbelieving various propositions, religious and otherwise.
It's just that he's a scientist. That's what he does. Science is the best way to know facts about what's true in all four quadrants. This is why there's an interior and exterior in every quadrant. In integral epistemology, zone is because there's some kind of systematic way of getting at the truth of every quadrant, and that means a scientific approach to every quadrant. So it's not at all about denying interiority.
One of the things you did say in the moral landscape, and I think this is associated with your interest in spirituality, is that there is some baby mixed in with the bathwater. And the question is, how do we distill that out?
Yeah.
And the objections that you're raising are the objections that are, look how difficult it is to do the distillation. It's like, yeah, absolutely, man.
It's clearly still developing. My point is, we should be able to agree that having a worldview guided by a continuous, honest engagement with reality, insofar as we can apprehend it, is better than having a worldview solidified or anchored to unchanging ideas that were born of people who had none of our present tools, none of our present insights into anything.
When Ken Wilber says that he still won't come around, maybe this is what he means.
People like Deepak Chopra will tell you that in the darkness of your closed eyes, you can realize your identity with the one mind that gave birth to the cosmos. This is a specious claim. There's nothing about meditation that is akin to doing cosmology, and you don't get insights about what preceded the Big Bang from doing any of these practices. But this is where we encounter true intellectual atrocities. I've studied with great mystics. I've met great meditation masters who've spent 20 years in caves perfecting the kinds of techniques of meditation that you would adopt or recommend. They don't know a damn thing about physics. Having an experience of undivided consciousness does not tell you what consciousness really is. There's nothing about introspection that leads you to sense that your subjectivity is at all dependent or even related to voltage changes and chemical interactions going on inside your head. You can drop acid, you can meditate for a year, you can do whatever you want to perturb your nervous system. You can feel yourself to be one with the universe, and at no point in that transformation do you get a glimpse that there's 100 trillion neurons in your head or synapses in your head that are doing anything. It's called absolute subjective ignorance of what's actually going on outside your consciousness.
The last thing I want to say just very quickly is that both of them are fully aware of waking up, and neither of them include that in their argument.
Are you kidding me? Harris's podcast is called Waking Up, named after a book and a talk that he did called Waking Up. But recently he changed the name of his podcast to Making Sense, so that way it wouldn't be confused with this new meditation app that he's coming out with. So yes, definitely Sam Harris includes Waking Up. This man has developed a meditation app. He does include it in his argument. It's very much a part of what Sam Harris is always talking about. So to say that he doesn't include it is like...
What you talking about, Wilber?
Wilber doesn't listen to enough Sam Harris, apparently. Clearly, he's strawmanning his position pretty hard here.
And it's weird because the actual super core of a spiritual system is the system of waking up. It's not developing a series of beliefs. Even the Christian mystics would do more like what St. Paul said. Let this consciousness be in you, which was in Christ Jesus, that we all may be one.
See, this is where Ken Wilber starts to do that thing I was talking about, where he wants to act like all of religion is actually trying to say Buddhism. He's trying to conflate all mountaintops to be into the mountaintop that he favors.
What always happens when people want to push the great religions into one box, into one mountaintop, rather than many mountaintops, is you come up with your own ad hoc idea of what mountaintop is. Oops, it just happens to be my vision of what religion should be. So maybe ultimately there's one God, who maybe sounds and talks and walks a lot like Jesus. Or, maybe it's the mystical experience, which just happens to be the piece of religion that you value. Or maybe it's compassion, which just happens to be your particular preoccupation with what the religion should be doing. But in any case, it's you.
Fundamentally, every major wisdom tradition wants you to move from an identification with finite phenomenal events, absolute subjectivity.
Christian mystics also believe in state training, which is waking up, which is the main thing of religion, when actually this is the main thing that Ken Wilber values. It's not the main aspect of religion. And according to the Wilber-Combs matrix, whatever state experience you have is always understood from whatever stage of development you're at. And we only ever have our own worldview to interpret whatever experience we have. And so part of Wilber's problem is that he's still interpreting his spiritual experience as validating some traditional dogma, the idea of I amness before the Big Bang. I have a video on it. You can definitely check for links below. This is Wilber's main problem, and we see it here. Wilber's view is actually a lot closer to Sam Harris's view, but he doesn't see that because Sam Harris is more scientific, more materialistic, and Wilber's got bigger allergies and negative reactions against Sam Harris. So even though Sam Harris would agree with Wilber a lot more, because Peterson is an idealist, Wilber's actually more sympathetic to Peterson's view. sadly enough. In terms of the overemphasis on translation, Integral has created all kinds of hacks: integral Christianity, integral Buddhism, integral business, integral recovery, conscious capitalism, and conscious consumerism. So all of these hacks into the current systems that we already have, but we hear very little, if anything, about what new transformative, integrative systems of the future might look like. And I think Sam Harris actually points us more in this direction in a more reasonable way than Wilber does. Sam Harris isn't encouraging all of us to just become Buddhist. He wants to find some new integrative tradition that takes the best from spirituality, from religion, from all practices, and says, this is human spirituality, this is human stuff that works for everyone, everywhere. And to me, that's more integral.
It's inconvenient for me as an atheist that when someone dies, or when someone comes time to get married, or when you're looking for a rite of passage for your 13-year-old to experience, the only ready-made rituals and frameworks for that are religious in some form. I think we need to transcend sectarianism, ultimately. I think whatever is to be discovered in the present moment that's profound is, by definition, non-denominational. I think that the truth is deeper than any of our traditions, and I think we have to get out of the religion business as it's been practiced for thousands of years, and we have to find a language that is truly global and truly transcends the accidents of birth. It can't be that by virtue of birth, people in India or Mongolia don't have access to the truth that can be realized in the present moment. And so whatever rituals we have that frame these moments in life that are profound and I think need to be framed in a way that separates them from the rest of our superficiality. I think we need beautiful buildings and we need moments in life where we engage our ethical depth and what's most important to us, whether it's community or the transience of life or our hopes for our children, whatever it is. There's more than what we tend to access in our superficiality. But I think 1,000 years from now, or even 100, we need to find a moment where we have left our sectarianism behind. I view the secular project as being that, ultimately.
In the dark web, who, again, most of them, I think, are operating with integral cognitive capacities.
Notice he didn't say that Sam Harris is also integral, even though he's a part of the intellectual dark web. Because Sam Harris is a scientist, Ken Wilber is going to say that he's an exterior quadrant reductionist and reduce him to orange. This is where Ken Wilber's bias starts to show in his assessment of these guys.
That's a fairly good description of ultimate unity consciousness. That's why around the world there are various, at least sub-branches of religion that know about this. And it's called enlightenment, awakening, Sanskrit, it's moksha, pure freedom, it's satori, it's the great liberation.
Enlightenment, awakening, satori, all of these are Buddhist words, man. You're like, really, it's all Buddhism. Dude, bad integration, bias integration. This is how even Ken Wilber gets it wrong, because he doesn't have a skillful, fair, overarching methodology. He's got a bias integration. This is what my second What You Talking About Wilber video is about, how different people who claim to be integral want to reduce it all to their bias, to the tradition that they like. And then when we try to apply that on a larger scale, how it ends up being a major problem. This is why we really have to integrate diversity with discernment in a fair, overarching way, because when we start to apply it as the new next system, if it's biased, it's going to be unhealthy, it's going to be problematic, it's not going to be really universal. And so getting it right like this is super important. This is the problem with both Peterson as integral and Wilber as integral. They both want to act like their tradition is the one true way, which is the marker of first-tier thinking. With Wilber, it's Eastern dogma about the creation myth. With Peterson, it's Christianity, and it messes up the whole integration process because you start looking at everything through that lens and integrating according to your bias, which means that you're not giving equal or fair emphasis to all traditions.
Now, you said that I've been approaching this, say, from a Christian perspective. That's true, but there are reasons for that. It's the problem of multiple interpretations. It's the postmodern problem, is that there's an infinite number of potential interpretations. What do we do about that? I tried to use a consilience approach. So I looked at multiple religious systems. I looked at Christianity, I looked at evolutionary biology, I looked at philosophy, I looked at neuroscience, and I looked at the literature on emotion and motivation and literature on play that was very nicely delineated by Piaget, and I tried to see where there was a pattern that repeated across all dimensions of evaluation. If it manifests itself here, and here, and here, and here, and here, 6 places, and it's always the same pattern, then the probability that that pattern exists independent of my delusional interpretation is radically decreased.
Yeah, my claim, however, is that many of these things don't repeat. In fact, they're flipped around completely based on different religious assumptions in different cultures. If Hinduism and Christianity are irreconcilable, then there must be a deeper level of reality that explains why they both work, that can't be reducible to Christianity being true, or Hinduism being true.
This is crucial because if we still have people that really are at values that are absolutely committed to not integrating everything, then you're not going to get them integrated because they're all first tier. They can't solve that problem ever. By definition, first tier thinks that its values are the only correct ones. But second tier, that has the inherent capacity to see the importance of all of these. And so that's why a second tier integral orientation becomes so important.
All right, so basically we have a bunch of vague talk about how Jordan Peterson is integral as a way of taking a popular figure in the zeitgeist and using him as a means to teach people about integral and especially stages of development. I do think this is a worthwhile project. I myself have done it in many videos using Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris as a means to talk about integral because they're both so close and even seeming like if you put them together, maybe they could together somehow equal an integral perspective. I do think there's something to that, but I digress. So just as I finish editing this video, Rebel Wisdom comes out with a new Ken Wilber video about Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris and their arguments about truth. And if you remember this painting right back here, you remember that I made a video about that when it first happened. And Wilber completely misrepresents the argument between the two.
It's not a valid form of argumentation.
So I decided I'm going to include and address some of the topics in this video, though I'm going to kind of steer clear of the free will versus determinism debate, and then Alyosha and I will pick up that thread later in the Integral Review series. So look forward to that, and let's get into the content of this other video.
Another key concept from integral theory can perhaps resolve the well-known dispute between Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris, where they couldn't even agree on the nature of truth. From this perspective, Harris was insisting on a scientific, objective definition of truth, while Peterson was more interested in a cultural definition, truth as culturally agreed and transmitted through myth and story. For integral, both are right, but incomplete.
They do tend to emphasize different quadrants. And if they kind of push into each other, that there's some real core agreements. They really are differentiating in large measure according to these different quadrants, these different perspectives that they are taking as most fundamentally real. They acknowledge the others, but they tend to really come back and emphasize those particular perspectives, especially when the other person isn't including them. And that tends to be the way the argument goes. Is Sam will argue that that's just not right, and then Jordan will say, well, that's just not right. And so they get into that kind of lockup, even though they both sort of acknowledge the existence of all of them.
So this is a complete mischaracterization of what the argument between the two is about. This fits Ken Wilber's narrative really well, but it's not actually true. If you go back and you listen to the actual original podcast, what you're hearing is not a left-hand versus right-hand quadrant discussion. What you're hearing is a map versus territory discussion.
Before there was any understanding of the energy trapped in an atom, the energy was still trapped in the atom.
Basically, Sam Harris is saying there is an absolute territory, even if it's not useful for us, there is still a truth.
If there are scientific things that we could mess with that might destroy us all, it would be better if we didn't. Okay?
Yes, but they will be no less true. You clearly have to have a conception of facts and truth that is possible to know, that exceeds what anyone currently knows and exceeds any concern about whether it is useful or compatible with your own survival even to know these truths.
Okay, well then I would say that I don't think that facts are necessarily true. So I don't think that scientific facts, even if they're correct from within the domain that they were generated, I don't think that that necessarily makes them true. I know that I'm gerrymandering the definition of truth, but I'm doing that on purpose.
Sam Harris gives a bunch of really good examples, constantly pointing back to the fact that there is a fact of the matter, as he likes to call it. What he really means is there is an absolute truth. Even if we haven't yet discovered it, he says, there is a truth of the matter, even if we never discover it. See, this isn't talking about exterior quadrant scientific facts. He says that there's a fact of the matter about what JFK was thinking before he died. So we're not talking about exterior quadrant stuff. We're saying that there's a truth of the matter. There is an isness, as Ken Wilber would say.
The good, the true, the beautiful, they all have an isness factor, and that's what Sam focuses on.
And Sam Harris was saying that there's a problem with reducing everything down.
You're not noticing the price you're paying for redefining a word like truth. And ironically, it's probably even a steeper price than what these gender pronoun maniacs are attempting to pay for asking that everyone use their favorite word to describe their identity. It's possible to survive without having a clear notion of truth.
truth, but it's probably not possible to be reliably understood in a conversation about scientific reality or anything else that we're trying to talk about here. It seems to me what you're doing here is you are marrying the concept of truth, which is a epistemological one, also the concept of goodness, and maybe you want to freight it even more with the concept of beauty. You're going to fuse truth and goodness and even beauty together as this jewel that can't be spoken about in terms of its separate parts. Take my terrorist. We could put you in a situation where knowing something or not knowing something would get you killed, and yet the fact that it would get you killed doesn't reach into the truth value of the statement. If there's someone going around Toronto killing people for not being able to name all the U.S. presidents in sequence, and let's say he's wrong about what the sequence is, so if you give him a sequence that is in fact inaccurate, that is untrue, but it works for him and you survive, it doesn't make it true.
It makes it true enough to survive. It's not like you don't put your arguments forward with power and coherence. They're powerful arguments. And I'm not saying that I'm right.
You are saying that you're right in the sense that you're not persuaded by the argument here. It seems to me that you have to grapple with this. Or at the very least, I need to move forward knowing exactly what you're claiming here. And I don't believe that I do.
Sam Harris is basically saying to Jordan Peterson that his whole conception of truth is self-defeating and that he has to end up appealing to this other kind of truth to even make sense of what he's talking about. And so he winds up weaseling his definition. Basically, Jordan just says that this is the game he's playing, and even if it is inconsistent and incoherent, this is how he's going to play it. He's decided to play it this way. It's basically his belief system.
This is another claim of faith, I suppose, but when we're starting to mess around with the definition of fact and true, you get down to the place where you have to make axiomatic presuppositions.
And like I said, I talk about this stuff in my original video, and I explain it much better than Ken Wilber did in detail. You should check that out if you're interested in hearing more about that. Let's continue.
Sam, even though he'll say things like consciousness is real, consciousness is the only thing that can't be doubted, you can look at consciousness in a kind of objective way, and there are subjective truths, that kind of stuff, he still has a tendency to interpret what that means from a third-person deterministic fashion.
So this gets back to the idea of realism. Yes, Sam Harris is a realist. Sam Harris is also a scientific academic, and so this means he's not going to make claims based on personal belief or beyond his ability to know, and so he's going to be a hard agnostic until he can prove it, because that's the kind of reasonable and rigorous approach academics take. If only Ken Wilber took this kind of an approach, I would have a lot more respect for him, and he would actually be a lot better at doing integral.
What happens with Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson is how they come down on that side of this ultimate mystery of what's happening. And however much Sam acknowledges that ultimate unity consciousness and its subjectivity is real and all of that, he does tend to come down on the side of third-person objective realism.
So in the same way that Jordan Peterson is a lower left quadrant reductionist, Ken Wilber is an upper left quadrant reductionist. His Eastern spiritual ideas have him thinking that all the world arises in consciousness, and basically that the upper left quadrant is primary.
That you're aware of this room right now. This room is arising in your awareness. You can hear my voice. That's arising in your awareness. These are all objects arising in your awareness. All the things that you're aware of is the world of form. Whether it's me or my voice or the backdrop or is it open, you can see the clouds, you can see the mountains. That's all the world of form. The world of form is arising in your awareness. The awareness that you have is a kind of vast space in which everything is arising. The seer or the witness, the awareness, that itself is nothing you can see. In other words, you can see sights, but you can't see the seer. So the witness is that which is aware of everything that's arising, but you can't see the witness. If you can see the witness, that's just another object. First thing you notice about the witness is it doesn't have any qualities itself. It's just an empty space in which this is all arising. So emptiness is not a concept. That's exactly what emptiness isn't. It's not a thought or an idea or a concept. It's this vast, transparent openness in which everything is arising moment to moment. And yet also realize it's all arising within you. Clouds are arising in you. The mountain isn't out there. It's in your awareness. It's in your being. The mountain is a texture of yourself. Ken Wilber is the form arising in my awareness. Just like this chair is arising in my awareness, the room is arising in. I am that awareness. I am not Ken. I am not the chair. I am not. The world is illusory. Nature is illusory. Gaia is illusory. Ecology, all illusion, all part of the world of form. Brahman alone is real. Emptiness alone is real. Your primordial self alone is real. So you have to disidentify with objects and find this ever-present witness that you are. That's also your original face, the face you had before your parents were born, the face you had before the Big Bang. Once you find that, that's the Brahman alone is real. Brahman alone is real. Brahman is the world.
See, this is where it gets confusing. Ken Wilber likes to paint Sam Harris as an exterior quadrant reductionist, even though that's clearly not the case. But right now, I'm saying that Ken Wilber is an upper left quadrant reductionist to some extent. But it's also clearly the case that Ken Wilber takes into account all four quadrants. So what's going on here? Well, this is a claim about primacy. This is a claim about ontology and cosmology and the origins of the unfolding of the quadrants. quadrants. Ken Wilber, he's going to say that the quadrants tetra arise in consciousness.
So the fourth is arising in your awareness.
So all of this is happening in consciousness.
The empty space in which this is all arises.
From his perspective as an idealist, the world isn't real. The world is a persistent illusion that arises in consciousness.
So of course you want to work to alleviate suffering, and you want to work to alleviate hunger. But on the absolute side, the analogy is if you're in a dream at night and there are thousands of people starving, there are two ways you can stop their hunger. One is in the dream you can try to feed them all, but the second is you can wake up, and that will end their suffering immediately.
He thinks that when you awaken, you realize that basically the world isn't real. This is part of his literal Buddhist way of thinking about things. And so this corrupts his view. Not only does it corrupt his view, but it kind of messes up his ability to really care enough to get involved in the world, which is why a lot of people have never even heard of Ken Wilber. Ken Wilber and Sam Harris both talk about state training and waking up, but they do talk about it a little bit differently. Sam is a longtime practitioner of mindfulness.
There are many different kinds of meditation. The kind I've done is traditionally a Buddhist practice. Many people know of as mindfulness. And I've done this on retreat where you go into silence for weeks or even months at a time.
And so he describes this deconstruction of the self where at a certain point the center drops out and there's just the world.
The way I talk about the self is one where the punchline is that our conventional sense of self is an illusion. It's an illusion that you can cut through neuroanatomically when you just look in the brain. There's no place in the brain for a unitary self to be hiding. There's no one place in the brain where everything comes together, where there's a rider on the horse of consciousness who can appropriate everything in experience. Anatomically, that doesn't make sense. But as a matter of direct first-person experience, I also think it doesn't make sense. When you interrogate the sense of self through a technique like meditation, it can fall away. You don't feel identical with your body. You very likely feel like you have a body, that you are up in the head and you're riding around in your body like it's a vehicle. The sense that you're located in the head. It's also the feeling that you are the thinker of your thoughts, that there's a thinker in addition to the next thought that arises. Not only do thoughts arise in consciousness, but you feel like you're the one who they're arising to. You are the man in the boat riding the river of consciousness. Whereas there really is just the river. There is no boat bobbing on the river. There is just the flow of seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, thinking, all of the energy that is arising in this moment in consciousness. And anything you can call a world is part of that. The sense that you're on the edge of the world looking at it, behind your face. Your face is a kind of mask, and you're behind it, and then there's the world. That can break down. If you look closely enough at that, that can drop away, and then on some level there's just the world. And I view every spiritual career, ultimately, even explicitly religious one, Christian ones, or Sufi ones, or Hindu ones, moments of self-transcendence have this character of losing the sense of being separate from the world, losing the sense of being separate from your experience. And that's the way consciousness is intrinsically. It takes some work to recognize it.
And I've heard Wilber talk about things in a very similar way before. But when he talks about I amness before the Big Bang and this kind of nervy kalpa samadhi type of experience, he's talking about not a waking state kind of realization, but the kind of experience that you would generally have with your eyes closed and a still mind. He interprets it as there is just I amness. There is just pure witnessing awareness. There is just consciousness. So while Sam says there's just the world,
that can drop away, and then on some level there's just the world.
There's just the universe in flux. Wilber says there's just I amness.
The world is illusory. Nature is illusory. Gaia is illusory. Ecology, all illusion, all part of the world of force. Brahman alone is real. Emptiness alone is real.
Meaning there's just consciousness, and everything that arises in consciousness. This is the primary disagreement between the two. And I actually think that Sam Harris's side is actually more reasonable and in touch with integral theory, while Ken Wilber betrays his theory in favor of his bias.
It's not a claim about the metaphysics. It's not a claim that the universe is made of consciousness. I'm kind of agnostic as to what the relationship between consciousness and the physics of the world is. And we certainly don't understand it at this point. But as a matter of experience, there is just consciousness and its content.
So yes, Sam Harris is a realist, but not because of some dogmatic belief, but because that's what the evidence seems to suggest.
There's a false assumption about science operating here. Science is not in principle committed to the idea that there's no afterlife, or that the mind is identical to the brain, or that materialism is true. Science is completely open to whatever in fact is true. And if it's true that consciousness is being run like software on the brain, and by virtue of ectoplasm or something else we don't understand can be dissociated from the brain at death, that would be part of our growing scientific understanding of the world if we could discover it. And there are ways we could in fact discover that if it were true. The problem is there are very good reasons to think it's not true. And we know this from now 150 years of neurology, where you damage areas of the brain and faculties are lost. Everything about your mind can be damaged by damaging the brain. The way in which our mind is parcellated at the level of the brain is not at all intuitive, and there's a lot known about it.
When we look at the evidence within the context of science and a valid theory, through the quadrants, we can track and correlate the development of interior capabilities to tangible exterior hardware that makes those things possible.
And so if we could know all of brain neurophysiology, at some point he explicitly says, then we would understand all of evil and presumably be able to fix that. And again, that's just pushing it way, way, way too far.
He says it's pushing it way too far, but look what he actually said.
There are truths to be known about how human communities flourish, whether or not we understand these truths. And morality relates to these truths. So in talking about values, we are talking about facts. Now, of course, our situation in the world can be understood at many levels. There's from the level of the genome on up to the level of economic systems and political arrangements. But if we're going to talk about human well-being, we are of necessity talking about the human brain, because we know that our experience of the world and of ourselves within it is realized in the brain. So the contributions of culture, if culture changes us, as indeed it does, it changes us by changing our brains. And so therefore, whatever cultural variation there is in how human beings flourish can, at least in principle, be understood in the context of a maturing science of the mind, neuroscience, psychology, etc.
This is the Integral Project.
Then an enlightened society would include ways to help us do that.
We want to be able to understand, using the Western Enlightenment Project, science, and our best maps, to figure out how development goes wrong, how we can fix these potential problems and spot issues early on and fix them before they get way out of hand. Like, part of, I think, what we would want to do in an integral society is to figure out optimal development and work people through that. And that's all going to be reasonable based on this cause and effect type of thing. And here you are, Wilber, basically saying that this is an unrealistic and unreasonable project. You're cutting your feet off, man. You're cutting the legs out from underneath this integral project. This is the kind of stuff that we need to be working on. And actually, Sam Harris is out there on the front line, actually being willing to put himself in public, talk about these things, and advocate for them. If anything, Sam Harris might be the most public and best voice of integral depth and span utilitarianism that we can actually point to as a public figure who's talking about these things, who's reaching a lot of people. I get annoyed the way that he's so dismissively talking about Sam Harris and giving Jordan Peterson such high praise, when it seems pretty clear to me that Sam Harris is actually doing a lot better, is a lot more integral, and a lot more healthy than Jordan Peterson. But I digress.
How we get to those is different from how we get to a mere objective understanding.
Did you hear him say a mere objective understanding? As if there's measuring stuff with science, like you can have that mere objective understanding of a something, but the real experience you'll have, the real knowledge of it, is this first-person experience. The reason we have a scientific revolution was because first-person experience is the least reliable type of experience, which isn't to say it's not valid. If we're talking about an exterior, tangible reality, science is the best at knowing about that thing. If it's a thing, science is the best at knowing about it.
So how we understand that atoms make up molecules is different in terms of how we understand what you and I should be doing. There's an overall type of truthness to whatever we're saying. There's an isness to whatever we're saying. So even if my values arise in my awareness, if I'm aware of them, they have an isness. They exist. They're phenomenologically real. And so I can say, well, that's the isness. That's real. And then the same is true for the good, the true, the beautiful. They all have an isness factor. And that's what Sam focuses on.
That's right. And part of Wilber's problem is when it comes to skillful integration, he's looking in the wrong quadrant for data. He thinks he can prove facts about the origin of the universe and the development of consciousness by closing his eyes and looking at his still mind through the lens of Buddhism. This is not skillful integration. He's not even really true to his own theory and his own maps, and that's the problem.
He'll just say, well, there are things that are ultimately true, and he focuses on the isness of that, and that's what we should go for. And again, that's fine. But the methods that you get to those isnesses, those are still different. And Sam is focusing on those right-hand exterior approaches.
So we've covered this. Sam's a neuroscientist. He understands the difference between phenomenology and empiricism. We're just going to move on from this.
You have two fundamental, unprovable choices about how you want to view this relative world as it's arising. And there either is the creative advance into novelty, or there isn't.
He frames it here like, even though there's not good evidence, he believes it because it seems to explain things from his perspective. Yeah, but the problem is that his perspective is too heavily influenced by Eastern mysticism and Buddhism, and so there's a major bias, and that's why he wants to accept this minority-held position over what the majority of actual scientists think. And he basically ends up being like a Buddhist creationist, which is incredibly embarrassing. And that's one of the main reasons why you don't hear about integral in academia. It's not just that academia rejects stages of development. It's also that the way that Ken Wilber presents a lot of this stuff, some of his woo-woo ideas and his Eastern bias is getting in, and it becomes problematic. And that's part of why it doesn't get academic respect.
And I find the creative advance into novelty much, much more reflective of the world as as it is arising. And in terms of any sort of ultimate truth, that's where the waking up traditions simply come down and say, actually, you can't say anything about the relative world in an ultimate truth, because all of our concepts make sense only in terms of their opposites: pleasure, pain, good, bad, infinite, finite, up, down, in, out. So all of our concepts are based on opposites, but ultimate reality has no opposite. So we really can't conceptualize it.
And that's another type of opposite. Everything is opposites, but this is beyond opposites, because that's the other opposite. It's just like, you're still thinking in terms of opposites, and you really haven't got outside of your cultural conditioning to really see this thing. When I first came across Wilber and I was hearing him speak about awakening, I was definitely giving him the trans-rational benefit of the doubt. But after a while, I started to notice that he's always talking about it in Buddhist terms, never Christian terms, or even like the philosophical language of existentialism. It actually took me a while to figure out that the reason he's always talking about it in terms of Buddhism is because he's a literal dogmatic Buddhist, because I know Ken Wilber can make those distinctions. But what I would kind of expect for an integralist to do would be to talk about it in the terms of multiple traditions and cross-translate, like a multilinguist. So for example, I would consider myself to be a Christian. I would consider myself to be a Buddhist. I would consider myself to be an atheist, as well as a hard agnostic. To me, as an integralist, these are all compatible and they harmonize in a way that makes perfect sense. I'm going to argue that Ken Wilber's ideas here about I amness before the Big Bang and Eastern Enlightenment are both rootless and fruitless. They're rootless in that they're not supported by good logic in the first place, and they're fruitless in that they don't actually bring any of this ultimate knowledge to the table. It's like the realization of emptiness, and now I really know nothing. Super helpful. Thanks a lot. It's like these people who like channel aliens, and yet they don't ever bring any kind of like powerful new knowledge to the table that's like, whoa, that really changed our perspective. He's making these claims to absolute knowledge, but they're unfounded claims, verified through circular reasoning, and they're basically a literal interpretation of dogma, so no good roots, and they reap no fruits. There's no benefits from knowing this. It's great if you can get an existential awakening. It's great if you can learn some skills to be able to focus and get control of your mind. That's super good. But these things are not knowledge of the absolute truth of reality. I mean, come on, get out of here with that.
And the real genius of Mahayana Buddhism, the whole notion of emptiness, is that you can't literally say anything about the relative world that will end up being absolutely true, because you'll always end up contradicting yourself. Take any characteristic you want. It can be free will, or it can be determinism. It can be consciousness, or it can be matter. It can be truth, or it can be falsity. And call that X, and then he demonstrates that reality actually is neither X nor non-X, nor both, nor neither. That nothing you can say about the world is ultimately correct, including what I just said, and including what I just said there, and that too.
And now you're right back into the green swamp. What can we say about anything? Very useful. Thank you for that.
All of Mahayana Buddhism and virtually all the world's mystics agree.
And virtually all the world's mystics agree. No. Virtually all the world's mystics agree on methodology, but virtually all the world's mystics come to different conclusions using that same methodology. Back when I was a Christian, I could totally see myself saying, look, I can't logic you into this. I can't explain it to you. It's not gonna make sense if I sit here and try and tell you. What you have to do is you have to come with me to church. You have to worship with me. You have to open your heart, and you have to see if Jesus speaks to you. And until you've done that, until you've opened yourself in that moment and been there and had that experience, then you don't know. But we all know what the problem with that is. Even interpreting it in that way in the first place is circular reasoning, like the fact that I experienced Jesus proves Jesus. And we all agree that just because I went to church and had an amazing spiritual experience doesn't prove that Jesus exists. This is the same exact thing that Wilber is doing. He's trying to be like, well, until you've had this spiritual experience and you agree with me, then you just don't understand. And you can do all the science in the world that you want, but until you've had this first-person experience of Buddhism, you just don't know. I have the absolute truth. You have like a well-defined relative truth. That's what he's doing with Sam Harris here. He's pretending like he knows everything, even though he can't actually say anything about it. And he ends up betraying his whole project here with this one idea. Very sad.
In order to see this ultimate reality, you have to directly experience it. You have to actually awaken it yourself. And until that happens, everything you say about that it's wrong because you're just not in touch with it. So you can say, oh, it's God, it's not God, it's atheistic. It doesn't matter. You still don't know it. So everything you're saying is ultimately not right. And you keep doing that until you awaken the second mode of knowing that plugs you in to this direct first-person experience of a ground of all being. That's called enlightenment. That's called awakening. And that really is a mystery. It can neither be called void nor not void, but in order to point it out, we call it the void.
Come on now. Are we here to talk about getting people to become Buddhist, or are we talking about what healthy integral is about? This is where Ken Wilber betrays his methodology. This is not a good example of integral methodological pluralism. He's looking in the wrong quadrant for data. He's qualifying the unqualifiable. It's a pre-trans fallacy number 2, and I discuss all of this in my What You Talking About, Wilber? I Am This Before the Big Bang video. You should check it out. Let's continue.
And the whole point of that is you keep doing these meditative practices until you awaken that mode of awareness. And then you have this direct experience. And it can neither be described as deterministic or free will, causal or free. And that's the ultimate state of a Buddhist or mystical orientation.
Did you hear that? That's the ultimate state of a Buddhist or mystical orientation, conflating everything into Buddhism. Right back to it.
You can still give your relative arguments about which seems to work best in the relative realm. And that's why I say that a creative advance into novelty turns out to be probably the best way to describe that.
Unfortunately, scientists don't agree with him that this is the theory with the most explanatory power. He even winds up quoting some creationists. Listen to what one of Wilber's most long-standing critics has to say about this.
I see it now as a community who celebrates a certain body of ideas, but not in a very critical way. And that's strange because the claims and the statements made by Wilber and his students are meant to be scientifically valid. So it's quite obvious that you need to apply rationality to it in every kind of way. So in my website, Integral World, I've tried to embody that. And for 20 years now, I've posted critical reviews of Wilber and his ideas on the website all around the topic of evolution. That's a large domain, of course, but it is very central to integral theory because Wilber even started to use the label evolutionary for his every activity, where first integral was the label and the brand, it was now evolutionary. Compare that to the fact that he has actually zero understanding of the basics of evolutionary theory, and the very few things he has written about it are worse than an average creationist would dare to write. So that is a really horrible situation, intellectually speaking. The same thing with physics, because Wilber believes in his beloved eros in the cosmos, and that means a force behind the whole trend towards complexity and consciousness. From my side, I see that as begging the question big time, because that way you never have to explain how these things emerge. You just say there's a force behind it that does it. In science, that's a no-brainer, and even in complexity science, nobody would say that has any kind of validity as a cop-out. In fact, there are many interesting ways to explain the emergence of complexity, from the very small to the very large, and in no way do we need to resort to easy so-called explanations like there's a spirit behind it. That is the end of science and the end of rationality. The areas of biology and physics are relevant here. In biology, Wilber is just a crypto-creationist who has not even done his homework, and he tries to score his points as a politician with soundbites and slogans and ridicule. He has, I think, not even an interest in the field. He doesn't care about how birds fly or the human eye is evolved or species separate. For him, the only point that counts is that he can maintain there's a spirit behind everything, and this spirit can be contacted, and then this is the basis of modern spirituality. For me, that's just a non-relevant approach to the question, where does complexity come from? And there are so many interesting answers out there, no final answers, but interesting and substantial answers that don't beg the question. And that for me, this whole approach is very unfruitful that Wilber has taken, and it shows him as a kind of spiritual ideologist who just wants to promote his idea that there is an eros in the cosmos. The same goes for his dismissal of the famous second law of thermodynamics, which says that in the cosmos, things even out, they balance out. Heat and cold, all kinds of gradients flatten in the end. Wilber says in A Theory of Everything, hey, but simple observation tells us that things go from simple to complex, so that's a ridiculous idea, as he would call it later. Things go the opposite way. Well, if you really study that field, you see that both could be true. There's a paradox that even in a universe that burns itself up, stars burn until they have used up all their hydrogen. Complexity under certain specific conditions can arise. And it's especially this paradox that is interesting. Wilber wants nothing about this. He just dismisses the second law and says there's a trend towards complexity, and there's even a spirit behind that. Well, here again, he's completely out of touch with science. And that's really embarrassing for somebody who has a beta education, and he should know better than that. But the fields are very big, and I'm not claiming to have a very expert knowledge of it, but even as an amateur, I can find so many holes in his writings that it's embarrassing.
If this was really just totally obvious, it wouldn't be a perennial, unsolvable philosophical question. It does come down to that mystical notion that ultimately all of these concepts are based on opposites, and ultimate reality isn't an opposite. So you're always going to get caught up in these kinds of arguments, and you're never going to be able to argue them fully. The only way you're going to be able to know the real answer to any of that is to experience that pure ground. And then that will solve the issue for you in a direct and immediate sense.
Just ending on Buddhism. Here to talk about integral, but Buddhism.
the guy that got in the Texas Tower and shot up a bunch of people, he told his jailers that when he died, do an autopsy because something was wrong with his brain. And they did found a tumor. And so Sam will say, when we really understand everything about neurophysiology, we'll understand all of evil behavior, just like this tumor is causing Whitmore to do that.
I said I was going to steer clear of this free will stuff, and I am going to try to.
But just the problem with that is it's just too extremist a version of it. Because even if the tumor tended you towards antisocial behavior, it didn't say get in this particular tower at this particular time using this particular gun, shoot exactly these many people, cause exactly these many deaths. But that's a deterministic mechanism that he demands in order to interpret what's arising.
So this is getting a little bit ridiculous. Obviously, he's not saying that the tumor causes everything in this man's life. And the reason he chose that shotgun or that tower or whatever, those are also deterministic. They probably have a lot to do with proximity. And he also goes on to say this.
The whole notion of some degree of freedom in itself is very hard to describe adequately. Because as soon as you say what that free choice is, you can always come up with something that preceded it and it was outside of your control. And so you never really look like you have freedom. In the integral view, we have what's called a cosmic address, which is simply when you add up all of the various dimensions that a particular holon is at, what its quadrant is, what its level is, what its line is, what its state of consciousness is, what its type is, that gives you its sort of location in this manifest universe. And all of those constrain your activity right now. They're all determining it to some degree.
So yeah, there's that. He answers his own question.
If you actually push that deterministic position, it really gets into problems and doesn't work very well. I mean, we went from just simple quarks to the sonnets of Shakespeare. The undeniable fact of that is that novelty is just all over the bloody place. And if you have strict determinism, you can't get that. It's not going to happen.
And that's just a ridiculous claim. He has this idea like, if you don't have souls, if you don't have free will, there won't be novelty or evolution. Ken Wilber still believes in reincarnation.
Anybody who's a parent has 3 children knows that they come with souls, and they are 80% formed. And you treat them all the same, and you've got a doctor, a bank robber, and a serial murderer. It's absolutely mind-boggling. The easiest way is to just say reincarnation. They come with this repository. They come with souls.
He believes there's a soul. He believes that there's this spirit underlying everything. He still thinks that there's some extra stuff, even though there's no good reason to think that, and we don't really need to postulate any extra stuff in terms of actual explanatory power for why things work. So Ken Wilber rejects determinism in favor of some really flimsy version of free will to salvage and include his soul spirit stuff.
Somebody like Immanuel Kant wants to get you from a position that he considers unfree, other-directed. Your thoughts aren't your own. You're a conformist. You're part of the herd mentality, governed by other people's thoughts. And you can tell if that's happening. Or if you're self-determining, creating your own thoughts, you're having your own viewpoints, you're not conformist. You're not other-determined. Almost none of the believers in free will believe that there's maximal autonomy. That just means you're radically free and have no constraints on you whatsoever. Almost everybody that believes in some sort of free will believes that there are constraints.
So getting a meta perspective on your perspective is not a view from nowhere. It's still a heavily conditioned perspective. And if anything, learning about Buddhism or whatever, that's just more cultural conditioning. So as you learn and develop more up the spiral, you're getting more and more cultural conditioning. There's no getting out of it and making a choice beyond my conditioning. No, we are heavily conditioned beings. Everything we know and think about everything we think because we've been taught to think that way. Everything we know has been communicated to us by someone else. We are social creatures. There's a really good video series I like called Everything's a Remix. I would highly suggest it. It starts with music, then goes into movies, then it talks about technology. But the idea here is that how anything is created, it's by remixing the stuff that we already have.
These are the basic elements of creativity: copy, transform, and combine. The genes in our bodies can be traced back over 3.5 billion years to a single organism, Luca, the last universal common ancestor. As Luca reproduced, its genes copied and copied and copied and copied. Sometimes with mistakes, they transformed. Over time, this produced every one of the billions of species of life on Earth. Some of these adopted sexual reproduction, combining the genes of individuals, and altogether, the best adapted life forms prospered. This is evolution. Copy, transform, and combine. And culture evolves in a similar way, but the elements aren't genes, they're memes. Ideas, behaviors, skills. Memes are copied, transformed, and combined. And the dominant ideas of our time are the memes that spread the most. This is social evolution. Copy, transform, and combine. It's who we are, it's how we live, and of course, it's how we create. Our new ideas evolve from the old ones. Ideas are regarded as property, as unique and original lots with distinct boundaries. But ideas aren't so tidy. They're layered, they're interwoven, they're tangled. And when the system conflicts with the reality, the system starts to fail.
Everything's a remix. So what we're calling novel thoughts are just new remixes. And that's evolution. You don't need a soul or a spirit to make that kind of thing happen.
We do know if we're being conformist or if we're acting more on our own wishes and desires. We can tell that right now. We know if we're doing that right now or not. And if we do become more autonomous, then we are freer from the constraints and demands of a herd mentality. And we can do that whether or not there's brain determinism. Maybe my brain's totally determined right now. I can still make that choice. And the one is free and the other isn't free. You don't have to wait way down the road when we understand all of neurophysiology and can explain all of evil behavior according to Sam Harris. Whether you know all of the functioning of neurophysiology, you do know if you're being a conformist.
This stuff blows my mind. You know if you're being a conformist. So conformists all know that they're being conformists. So atheists, when they get outside of the tradition and they become atheists and they go to atheist groups, they all know that they're being conformists. You think if you went up to these free-thinking skeptics and said to them, you realize you're being conformist and part of a herd mentality right now, right? They would be like, oh yeah, of course. No. This is not how things work. Just because you get a meta perspective where you slightly transcend the culture doesn't mean that you now have free will. So let's do some of this Aquil analysis for Ken Wilber and Sam Harris. Let's start with Sam Harris. Sam Harris includes all four quadrants and is probably actually the most true to integral methodological pluralism of the three of these guys. He does not include stages of development. So this is a major missing ingredient from Sam's perspective. In some part, implicitly including stages, I would say. Almost want to give him half credit for it because he definitely can tell the difference between fundamentalists and moderates, between atheists and postmodernists. So I actually think with the right introduction, he would be very sympathetic to stages. I don't really hear Sam Harris talk about lines explicitly, but he seems to include them, understanding that different people have their different areas of expertise. That seems to be something that he's mentioned on a couple different occasions. So we can include that. When it comes to states, actually, Sam Harris has developed this meditation program and seems to be pretty fluent in states. And in my opinion, he does so more skillfully than Wilber. I haven't heard Sam talk about types, but I'm pretty sure he includes them, or would have no problem with them. So Sam Harris definitely has some super high-minded ideas up here about how we can take these integral ideas and make the world better with them. That stuff is awesome. It seemed like for a while he had some issues with pre-trans fallacy number 1, but more and more we're seeing him have a more healthy relationship with transrational poetry. And when he's talking to Jordan Peterson, basically I think what he's saying is, I realize there's value in this stuff, but how can we get at the value and avoid some of the terrible pitfalls of the past? And Jordan Peterson just doesn't know the answer to that question. I think with the right introduction, he would be very sympathetic to a healthy integration of religion and spiritual practice. I just think that he hasn't really heard anybody as of yet who can skillfully explain to him what that looks like and how we can avoid some of the problems. Actually, I think if you look at a lot of Sam Harris's ideas, his ideas about gun control, extending care to animals, and immigration, things like this, they all are these nuanced, integral perspectives taking into account a lot of these factors. All right, let's talk about Wilber. When it comes to quadrants, Wilber does include all 4 quadrants, but he tends to overemphasize and favor the upper left quadrant, so that's a problem. He talks about stages, but he ends up perverting those stages in favor of his bias, so that's a major problem. I could probably say the same thing about lines, because obviously he's tried to throw Aurobindo state stages on top of Piaget where they don't really belong, and so this is clearly a corruption of the meta-analysis of the different lines. But maybe we'll just give him the maybe on this one. States. Of course, Wilber includes states, and this is the guy from which we get the Wilber-Combs matrix, where we can get this horizontal and vertical waking up and growing up. Really good tool to be able to understand states in a developmental context. He gives us all of these great maps and distinctions, but then he of course understands these states in the light of his Eastern worldview, and that again corrupts his thing. So let's give him the maybe. Types, of course. Everyone's doing good on types. Let's give him the green light on the types. Notice when we compare, Peterson and Wilber are not doing as good as Harris is when it comes to having a healthy integral perspective. And of course, Wilber and Peterson both have the same problem of convoluting everything back into their tradition, and this messes up their integration. While you might want to say this might be true of Sam Harris too, right? Like he's an academic or he's a scientist, but again, all this does for him is it makes him rigorous. It gives him intellectual honesty and humility to the point where he won't overstep his bounds. So he tends to be kind of a hard agnostic, and he won't make claims beyond his ability to know. I personally wouldn't call that bias. I would call that an inherent lack of bias. So when we look at what Wilber is doing, he of course came up with the integral map. He's put together all these factors. He's the one that said that we should include them all. But of course, pre-trans fallacy number 2, he still holds on to the literal version of these Eastern dogmatic worldviews, and that becomes highly problematic. He's still got some magical thinking down here. He believes in psychics and magical blessings on crops. I'll put a couple links down below to articles about this kind of stuff. He's got issues with his ego and shadow. I think white privilege is also a problem, and why he doesn't see a problem with capitalism and just wants to translate all the time. Some people have also suggested that money and profit have corrupted integral projects. So Wilber has some serious shadow work to do. But of course, he's the first word on this subject. He came up with a lot of this stuff. Generally, the first word on a subject doesn't get it perfectly. Generally, it's the people who come a generation or so after them who see both the criticism and their project and go, okay, this is good stuff, and these criticisms are true too, so how can we integrate the criticisms of Integral and Integral to create Integral 2.0 and take this project further? And that's what we really need to be doing. And so just as I'm putting the finishing touches on this video here, this new video from Rebel Wisdom comes out, and this guy's making a lot of the same points that I'm making. So I think this is a really good companion piece to this video that you're watching now. I would suggest that you check it out. I think Jamie Wheal does a great job making a lot of these criticisms, and I think I go a little bit more into detail about what's actually going on with these people, not just Wilber. And so I hope this helps. Big thanks to Rebel Wisdom for doing all this work and getting all these voices on the record. If you ever want to have me on, hit me up. I hope you enjoyed this talk. I hope you like, share, and subscribe. Support me on Patreon, and definitely check out my playlists of both Peterson as well as my What You Talking About Wilber series. Thanks so much for watching. Peace.